Chapter 1. Invitation. The town of Thornhill was small and seemingly forgotten by time. Nestled between thick forests and rolling hills, it held an air of mystery, a place where outsiders rarely ventured. Its narrow cobblestone streets twisted like veins through the heart of the town, leading to homes with aging, weather-beaten facades. The residents moved through their daily routines with quiet resolve, living under a cloud of old superstitions, long buried yet never truly forgotten. Among them was a house that stood out, not for its grandeur, but for the oppressive presence it cast over its surroundings. It sat at the edge of the town, where the trees grew thick and tangled, almost as if nature itself had sought to reclaim the land around it. The house was a relic of an older time, its stone walls weathered and dark, windows veiled behind layers of dust. Inside the house lived Clara, a woman of quiet composure who had inherited the house from a distant relative she had never met. She moved through the rooms slowly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the worn wooden floors. Dust motes swirled in the air as she brushed past the faded curtains, peering out into the gloom of the encroaching forest. There was something unsettling about the place. Though she had lived there for nearly a year, the house never felt like home. It felt like something was watching her from every shadow, from every corner. One evening, while the autumn sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a burnt orange glow across the town, Clara received an envelope. There was no return address, no name, only a wax seal with an emblem she did not recognize. The envelope was thin and brittle, as though it had been waiting for years to reach her hands. Inside, a single piece of parchment unfolded in her grasp. Written in ink so dark it appeared almost alive were the words, "You are invited." No time, no place, just the words, simple and stark. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the message, her thoughts spinning. It was unsettling, but there was something else about it. A pull, a strange compulsion that tightened her chest as she held the invitation. She didn't know why, but the message seemed to have been written for her, and her alone. The air around her seemed to thicken, as though the very walls of the house were leaning in, watching. That night, she tried to sleep, but dreams plagued her. Images flashed behind her eyelids. An ancient door hidden deep in the forest, a circle of figures cloaked in shadow, and something else. A presence, vast and unknowable, watching her. Always watching. When she woke the next morning, she found the invitation resting on her bedside table, though she was certain she had left it downstairs. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up again, reading the words over and over, but they never changed. The following days passed in a haze, but the invitation remained at the forefront of Clara's mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, something beyond the ordinary. She felt it in the way the trees seemed to whisper when she walked through the town, in the way the shadows stretched just a little too long, even in the daylight. The town itself seemed to sense her hesitation, its narrow streets and empty alleys pressing in, as if guiding her towards something she couldn't yet see. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the forest. The path before her was overgrown, the trees so thick that the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. She didn't remember how she had gotten there, only that she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to walk deeper. The invitation burned in her pocket, its presence like a beacon drawing her forward. She stepped into the forest, and as she moved further along the path, the air grew colder, the silence more profound. Her footsteps were swallowed by the earth, as though the forest itself sought to muffle her presence. She walked for what felt like hours, the trees growing taller and denser with every step, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The path narrowed, and soon she found herself standing before an ancient stone archway, half buried in the underbrush. It was cracked and weathered, covered in strange symbols she couldn't decipher. Without thinking, Clara stepped through the archway, and the moment she did, the forest behind her seemed to vanish. The air shifted, the trees becoming dark and looming, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. She glanced behind her, but the path was gone, swallowed by the dense woods. She was trapped. Ahead of her, a faint light flickered. It was dim and distant, but unmistakable. With no other option, Clara moved toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, she saw that the light came from a small clearing. In the center stood a single stone altar, ancient and covered in vines. The flickering light came from candles arranged around it, their flames barely illuminating the clearing's edge. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she approached. Carved into the altar's surface was the same emblem from the invitation's wax seal. She reached out, her fingers grazing the cold stone, and in that moment, something shifted in the air. The ground beneath her trembled, and a low, rumbling sound echoed through the trees. Suddenly, the candles went out, plunging the clearing into darkness. The invitation had been accepted. Chapter 2: Descent. The world around Clara shifted the moment the clearing plunged into darkness. She felt the ground beneath her feet lurch as though it had become unsteady, like the very earth was tilting her off balance. Her hands grasped at the cold stone altar, her knuckles white with fear, trying to anchor herself in the blackness that enveloped her. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on her chest like a weight, making it harder to breathe. She could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, a rapid, frantic rhythm that only served to amplify the silence around her. For what felt like an eternity, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The oppressive quiet seemed to stretch on endlessly, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves far in the distance. Every sound felt amplified in the suffocating darkness, each crack of a twig or shift in the underbrush carrying an ominous echo that filled her with dread. Suddenly, she felt something, a presence. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the temperature or the movement of air that she couldn't see. But it grew stronger, more tangible, like someone or something was drawing nearer. Her breath hitched, and her grip on the altar tightened as she fought the urge to run, to flee back into the unknown depths of the forest from which she had come. Then, a sensation struck her, a pulling deep within her chest, as though invisible threads were being drawn tighter around her soul. It was a force that was not external, but internal, compelling her to move forward, to descend deeper into whatever nightmare had been set in motion. With trembling hands, she let go of the altar and turned slowly, her legs heavy as though weighted with stones. There was no light, no guiding flame to show her the way, but somehow, she knew where she needed to go. Her feet carried her across the clearing, over the soft moss and the brittle leaves scattered beneath her boots. The trees had closed in around the edges, their branches twisting and knotting like tangled wires, creating a canopy so dense that it felt as if the sky no longer existed. The once familiar forest path had transformed into something labyrinthine, winding and constricting with each step. As she walked, Clara noticed the ground beneath her shifting once more. The soft, forgiving earth gave way to something harder, colder. She knelt, running her fingers along the surface beneath her feet. It was smooth stone, carved with faint, barely visible lines that traced patterns too intricate to understand. She realized she was no longer walking on soil, but on a hidden pathway that had been concealed by the forest's overgrowth. With each step, the air around her grew colder, biting at her skin. Her breath puffed out in faint wisps as the temperature plummeted, though her pulse quickened, keeping her blood rushing hot through her veins. The sense of descent deepened as the forest seemed to fall away, the stone path leading her to an underground passage she hadn't noticed before. It was as though the ground had split open, revealing a jagged fissure that stretched deep into the earth. Her legs ached, her body growing weaker, yet she was driven by something beyond fear. Without hesitation, she stepped into the gap. The stone beneath her was slick and uneven, causing her to stumble more than once as the passageway narrowed around her. The oppressive air of the forest had given way to something far worse, a silence so profound that it felt like the very sound had been sucked from the world. The walls around her were damp, cold to the touch, and curved inward like the throat of some massive creature, swallowing her whole. The narrow passage wound downward, spiraling like a twisted staircase carved from the living rock. The walls, once smooth, were now rough and jagged, lined with cracks that leaked moisture, leaving the stones slippery beneath her feet. Her hands grazed the surface, trying to steady herself as she continued her descent, the darkness thickening with each step. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, like something ancient and forgotten had been left to rot for centuries in the belly of the earth. As she descended deeper, her senses began to shift. The boundaries of her perception blurred, and the passage itself seemed to change. She could no longer tell how far she had gone or how long she had been walking. Time lost all meaning in the depths of the descent. There were no sounds of life, no birds, no wind. Only the steady rhythm of her footsteps echoing through the narrow corridor, growing more distant with each passing second. At one point, she paused, feeling the weight of exhaustion bear down on her. She leaned against the cold stone wall, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space ahead. But there was no sign of an end, only the endless spiral downward. A tremor ran through her legs, the fatigue from the descent threatening to overwhelm her. But something, an instinct, a primal force, kept her moving forward, kept her from turning back. The deeper she went, the stranger the environment became. The walls began to pulse faintly, as though alive, their rough surfaces marked with symbols and glyphs she had never seen before. These markings seemed to glow faintly, a sickly green light emanating from the grooves in the stone. The air became thick with an unnameable energy, a sensation that crawled over her skin, making her feel both watched and utterly alone. At long last, the narrow passage widened, and Clara stepped into a vast, subterranean chamber. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. A cavern so large that its ceiling and walls stretched out into an endless black void. The stone beneath her feet was smoother now, polished to a shine that reflected the faint light coming from the strange, phosphorescent glyphs scattered across the room. At the center of the cavern stood an enormous structure, a monolith made of the same dark stone, towering and ancient. It was covered in the same glyphs that lined the passage, but here they burned brighter, their glow pulsating in time with a deep, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the stone. The hum resonated in her bones, in her chest, as though the very structure of the cavern was alive, breathing, waiting. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm, slowing, steadying as she approached the monolith. She could feel the pull again, stronger now, as though it came from within the stone itself, urging her closer. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingertips brushing the cold surface of the monolith. The moment she made contact, the hum grew louder, reverberating through her body. The glyphs flared with a blinding intensity, and the stone beneath her feet shuddered as though something immense had awakened. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the light dimmed, the hum faded, and silence returned to the chamber. Clara stood frozen before the monolith, her hand still pressed against its surface, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had descended into something far more ancient than she had ever imagined, something waiting to be unleashed. Chapter 3: Shadows. In the days that followed her descent into the subterranean cavern, Clara felt an unease that clung to her like a second skin. The surface world no longer felt the same. The sunlight, once warm and reassuring, now seemed cold, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the ground like tendrils. Each shadow flickered unnaturally, as though the light was struggling to maintain its hold over the ever-encroaching darkness. The house, which had always been a place of discomfort for her, had become even more stifling. The rooms, once filled with faint drafts of cold air and the smell of musty wood, now carried a weight that pressed down on her from all sides. Every corner seemed to hide something, and every shadow seemed to have a presence lurking within it. The windows were fogged with condensation, blurring the outside world as though a veil had fallen over it. Clara felt trapped, hemmed in by an invisible force that seeped into every crevice of her life. She spent hours pacing the rooms, trying to distract herself, but nothing held her attention for long. The hum of the monolith still resonated faintly in her bones, like a distant echo she couldn't shake. It followed her everywhere, even in her dreams, where dark figures loomed just beyond her reach, faceless and silent, always watching. In the corners of her vision, the shadows seemed to flicker and shift, their movements too subtle to catch head-on, but enough to send chills crawling up her spine. The shadows were different now. One evening, as she stood at the window of the second-floor bedroom, gazing out at the gnarled trees surrounding the house, she noticed something strange. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking and groaning, but there was something else, something darker, more sinister. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to pulse, a rhythmic movement that matched the distant hum she had felt in the cavern. They stretched and recoiled, shifting in ways that defied the logic of light and time. The longer she stared, the more certain she became that the shadows were alive. Suddenly, her reflection in the window caught her attention. Her own face stared back at her, but the expression wasn't hers. It was as if someone, or something, was watching her from within the glass, mimicking her movements but with a sense of malice, as though the reflection was waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. Clara recoiled, stepping away from the window, her breath quickening as fear settled in her chest. She wiped the moisture from the glass, but her reflection returned to normal, her pale face and hollow eyes staring back at her. But the feeling lingered. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep eluded her. The house was unnaturally still, the silence oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the groan of the wind against the old walls. Yet something else stirred. The darkness in the room seemed thicker, more tangible, pressing in from every side. Shadows gathered in the corners, pooling like ink, growing and shifting, almost as if they were alive. As she turned her head, her eyes fixed on a particular shadow near the far wall. It was darker than the rest, a void so complete it seemed to devour the dim light in the room. At first, it was still, a black shape in the shape of nothing. But then it moved. It wasn't a sudden motion, but a slow, deliberate shift, like something slithering through the darkness. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the shadow detached itself from the wall, stretching and growing, elongating like a figure rising from the depths of an abyss. The shape took form, solidifying into the outline of a figure, tall and hunched, with limbs that were unnaturally long and thin. It moved with a fluid, almost liquid grace, as though it were made of smoke or mist, drifting across the room without making a sound. Its faceless head turned toward her, as though it could see her even in the pitch-black darkness. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse loud in her ears as the shadow creature moved closer, inch by inch, until it loomed over her, its presence cold and suffocating. Frozen in place, Clara stared up at the entity, her body paralyzed by a fear so deep it rooted her to the bed. The creature hovered over her, its form shifting and rippling as though it were not fully anchored to this world. The air around it grew cold, a chill that seeped into her bones and made her shiver uncontrollably. Time stretched endlessly as the creature lingered, its featureless face mere inches from her own, as though it were studying her, waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow retreated. It melted back into the corner of the room, folding into itself until it became part of the darkness once more. The cold presence dissipated, leaving Clara gasping for air, her heart still racing. The shadows returned to their stillness, and the room was once again silent, but the feeling of being watched never left her. The following days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and dread. The shadow creature had not returned in the same form, but the darkness itself had become more animated. Every room seemed to hide a lurking presence, something that shifted just out of sight. Clara caught glimpses of movement from the corner of her eye, shadows that slid across the floor, dark figures standing just beyond the doorways, and shapes that vanished as soon as she turned her head. The house had become a living entity, breathing and pulsing with a malevolent energy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The shadows crept closer, no longer confined to the corners and edges of the rooms. They began to stretch across the walls, moving with an unnatural speed, coiling and twisting like serpents. Each night, they grew bolder, closing in around her bed like a swarm of blackened spirits. Clara found herself trapped within the house, the outside world fading into an indistinct blur beyond the windows. The days passed in a strange, disjointed rhythm, each one marked by the ever-encroaching darkness. The shadows seemed to follow her everywhere now, slipping under doors, creeping along the floors, and clinging to her like a cloak of fear. Even in the rare moments when the sunlight broke through the clouds, the shadows remained, refusing to yield to the light. One evening, as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky, Clara noticed something new. The shadows had taken on a shape, familiar but distorted. They had begun to mirror her movements, following her like a twisted reflection. Each time she moved, they moved with her, their forms growing sharper, more defined. They mimicked her steps, her gestures, even the way she breathed. But there was something off about them. Their movements were too smooth, too fluid, as if they were not bound by the same rules of reality. The realization struck her like a blow. The shadows were not just following her. They were becoming her. They were learning her patterns, her habits, her very essence. The longer they stayed, the more they absorbed, until they would no longer be mere reflections, but something far more sinister. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she felt the shadows gather once more. But this time, they did not stop at the edges of the room. They reached out toward her, curling around her like tendrils of smoke. Her skin prickled as the cold, dark shapes brushed against her, and a deep, overwhelming sense of dread settled in her chest. The shadows had found her, and they were not going to let her go. Chapter 4. Whispers. Days turned into weeks, and the oppressive presence of the shadows became an almost constant companion. Clara had grown accustomed to the stillness of the house, its strange silences punctuated only by the creaks and groans of the aging structure. Yet now, a new sound had begun to fill the void, something far more unsettling. It started as a faint murmur, barely perceptible, like the soft rustling of leaves in a distant wind. At first, Clara dismissed it as nothing more than the house settling or the branches brushing against the windows. But over time, the sound grew louder, more insistent, and it soon became clear that these were not random noises. They were voices. They were always at the edge of hearing, too soft to discern words but unmistakable in their tone. The voices seemed to come from the walls themselves, seeping out of the cracks in the plaster, filling the air with an eerie, disembodied chatter. They carried a rhythm, a cadence, as though engaged in some secret conversation just out of reach. Clara tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the few mundane tasks that still connected her to the real world. Making tea, tidying up, watching the shifting light as it moved through the house. But the voices persisted, growing louder with each passing day. They seemed to follow her, moving from room to room, always just behind her, never revealing themselves fully. It was as if the house itself had become a vessel for their whispers, a conduit for something unseen. One morning, as Clara sat in the kitchen staring blankly at the wall, the voices intensified. They were no longer a distant murmur but a steady stream of noise, filling the room with a chorus of overlapping tones. The sound seemed to swirl around her, circling like vultures, rising and falling in waves of incomprehensible sound. She could feel them now, pressing in on her from all sides, their presence as palpable as the shadows that had once tormented her. She stood abruptly, knocking over the cup of tea she had been holding. The liquid spilled across the table, dripping onto the floor, but Clara hardly noticed. Her focus was on the walls, the source of the voices. They seemed to be calling her, urging her to listen more closely, to understand what they were saying. The sound was hypnotic, drawing her in like a moth to a flame. She moved toward the far wall, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the voices growing louder with each step. As she reached out to touch the rough surface, the air around her seemed to vibrate, the voices now a cacophony of sound, swirling and overlapping in an unintelligible storm. Her fingers grazed the wall, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The stillness was suffocating, the absence of sound even more oppressive than the voices had been. Clara stood frozen, her hands still pressed against the wall, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. And then it came. A single voice, clearer than the rest, rose from the depths of the wall. It was soft, almost soothing, but there was an edge to it, a dark undercurrent that sent a shiver down her spine. The voice was speaking directly to her now, not in words but in feelings, emotions that flooded her mind in an instant. Fear, loss, anguish, despair. The intensity of it was overwhelming, and Clara staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The flood of emotions subsided as quickly as it had come, leaving Clara gasping for breath, her hands trembling. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, watching her. But she was alone. The house was silent once more, the voices gone as if they had never existed. But Clara knew better. They were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. She could feel them now, a constant presence that had woven itself into the very fabric of the house. The walls, once a simple barrier between her and the outside world, had become something else entirely. They were alive, pulsing with the energy of the voices, feeding off her fear. The next few nights were worse. The whispers returned with a vengeance, louder and more insistent than before. They filled every room, every corner of the house, leaving Clara no place to hide. She could no longer sleep, the incessant chatter keeping her awake, her mind fraying at the edges as exhaustion set in. The voices seemed to grow angrier, their tone shifting from curiosity to hostility, as though they were frustrated with her refusal to listen, to understand their message. In a desperate attempt to escape, Clara fled the house one night, running blindly into the forest that surrounded the property. The cool air was a welcome relief, and for the first time in days, the voices were silent. She wandered through the trees for what felt like hours, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the quiet night. The forest, dark and foreboding as it was, felt safer than the house. Here, at least, she could breathe. But even the forest was not free from the influence of the house. As she walked deeper into the woods, she began to notice strange things. The trees seemed to bend toward her, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands, their leaves whispering in the wind. The air grew colder, and the familiar sensation of being watched returned. The whispers were back, softer now but unmistakable. They followed her, weaving through the trees, surrounding her from all sides. Clara's pace quickened, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had no destination in mind, only the desperate need to escape the relentless voices. But no matter how far she ran, they were always there, just behind her, growing louder with each step. The forest itself seemed to twist and turn, leading her in circles, trapping her in a maze of darkness and shadows. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, Clara stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone structure, half buried in the earth, its surface covered in moss and vines. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, as though the stone itself was amplifying them. Clara hesitated for a moment, her mind racing, before stepping toward the structure. As she reached out to touch the cold, weathered stone, the voices erupted in a violent crescendo, flooding her mind with a torrent of emotions and images. Visions of the past, of people long gone, of horrors too terrible to comprehend. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, and for a brief moment, the world around her dissolved into chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the forest still and quiet once more. Clara stood alone in the clearing, her hand resting on the stone, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. The voices had followed her into the forest, and now they were inside her. Chapter 5. The Veil. The fog rolled in thick and heavy that morning, creeping over the landscape like an ethereal blanket, blurring the boundaries between earth and sky. Clara stood at the window, staring out at the world that had been swallowed by the mist. The house felt more isolated than ever, as though the fog had severed its connection to the outside world, leaving it adrift in a sea of white. For days, the fog remained, clinging to the air, soaking the ground and trees with its damp chill. It became a permanent fixture, an oppressive force that seemed to wrap the house in a shroud, dulling the senses and creating a sense of timelessness. Hours bled into one another, and the days became indistinguishable from the nights. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only the endless gray of the mist. Clara moved through the house in a daze, the fog outside mirrored by the fog that had settled over her mind. Her thoughts felt distant, disconnected, as though she was no longer fully present in her own life. She wandered from room to room, unsure of what she was looking for, but always searching, as if something was missing. The silence of the house had changed. It was no longer the eerie, oppressive quiet that had once unnerved her. Now it was a thick, muffled absence of sound, like the entire world had been wrapped in cotton. Even the creaks and groans of the old house were muted, as though the fog had smothered them. And yet, beneath the surface, there was movement. Subtle shifts in the air, barely perceptible, but present. Clara could feel it, a slight stirring that she couldn't explain. It was as though something was passing through the fog, moving just out of sight, hidden by the veil of mist that surrounded the house. She would catch glimpses of it sometimes, a faint flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow that darted across the room before vanishing. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. The isolation, the fog, the strange happenings in the house. It was all taking a toll, warping her perception of reality. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. The unseen presence was becoming bolder, more tangible. It was no longer just a fleeting shadow or a trick of the light. It was real, and it was growing closer. One night, as Clara lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she felt it again. A subtle shift in the air, like the faintest of breezes brushing against her skin. The fog outside the window pressed against the glass, thick and impenetrable, as though the house was sinking deeper into its grasp. The darkness of the room seemed to stretch and warp, the corners fading into the mist, leaving only a small island of light where Clara lay. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but sleep would not come. Her mind raced, her thoughts spiraling into strange, disjointed patterns. She felt disoriented, as if the boundary between waking and dreaming had dissolved. Time itself seemed to lose its meaning, the hours stretching into an endless void. And then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a breath. It was close, far too close, as though someone, or something, was standing beside her bed, watching her. Clara's heart raced, her body frozen in place, her mind screaming for her to move, to get up, to flee. But she couldn't. She lay there, paralyzed by fear, her eyes squeezed shut, listening to the faint rustling sound that seemed to fill the room. Slowly, she opened her eyes, her gaze darting around the darkened room. The shadows had grown longer, deeper, the fog outside casting a faint, ghostly glow through the window. But there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent, save for the steady pounding of her heart in her ears. Clara sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold beneath her feet, the chill seeping through her skin and into her bones. She stood, her movements slow and deliberate, as though the air itself was resisting her. The fog pressed against the window like a living thing, writhing and churning in the pale moonlight. She moved toward the window, her hand reaching out to touch the glass. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, as though the fog had drained all warmth from the air. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer, peering into the swirling mist outside. At first, she saw nothing, only the endless gray expanse of fog, shifting and swirling like a living entity. But then, deep within the mist, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a faint shadow, barely visible through the thick fog. But as Clara watched, the shadow grew larger, more defined. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, with long, flowing robes that seemed to blend into the mist. Its face was hidden, obscured by the folds of its hood, but Clara could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, piercing through the fog and into her very soul. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure began to move toward the house, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was gliding through the mist rather than walking. Clara's hand tightened on the window frame, her knuckles white with tension. The figure was getting closer, its form growing more distinct with each passing second. There was something horribly wrong about it, something unnatural, as though it didn't belong in this world. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the line of trees that bordered the house, its hooded head tilted upward, staring directly at Clara. She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her heart pounding in her chest as the figure remained motionless, watching her from the shadows. For what felt like an eternity, Clara stood frozen at the window, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure. The fog swirled around it, obscuring its form, but she could still feel its presence, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to reach out and wrap around her like a suffocating blanket. And then, without warning, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, standing at the edge of the trees, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the fog. The mist seemed to close in around the spot where it had stood, as though erasing all trace of its existence. Clara stepped back from the window, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She didn't know what she had just seen, but she knew one thing for certain. The figure in the fog was real, and it was coming for her. The fog outside thickened, pressing closer to the house, and the air inside grew colder. Clara backed away from the window, her mind racing, her thoughts jumbled and incoherent. She could feel it now, the presence that had been lurking just out of sight, watching her from the shadows. It was no longer content to remain hidden. The fog was no longer just a natural phenomenon. It was a veil, a barrier between two worlds, and something had crossed over. Chapter 6: The Shadows. In the dim light of dawn, the forest loomed large and ancient, its towering trees casting jagged shadows across the underbrush. The sun was barely rising, a faint glow filtering through the dense canopy, giving everything a muted, grayish hue. For as long as he could remember, Noah had been drawn to these woods, to their silence, their mystery. But now, standing at the edge of the tree line, he felt something different, a sense of hesitation, as though the forest had changed overnight. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than before, darker, as if something was lurking within them, just out of sight. The familiar path that led through the woods appeared distorted, as though it stretched longer than it should. Noah hesitated, his instincts telling him to turn back, to retreat to the safety of his cabin. But the pull of the forest was stronger, an unspoken force urging him forward. With deliberate steps, he ventured into the woods. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, the ground soft beneath his boots. Each footfall seemed to echo in the stillness, the only sound in an otherwise silent world. The trees crowded around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, forming a tunnel of shadow that swallowed him whole. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The sun, which had barely risen, seemed to fade away, leaving the forest shrouded in twilight. Noah's heart began to race, the silence pressing in on him, amplifying his growing sense of unease. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no birdsong. Only the oppressive quiet, thick as a blanket. As he walked, he noticed the shadows shifting. At first, it was subtle, just a trick of the light, he told himself. The way the trees moved in the breeze, perhaps. But the more he watched, the more he realized that the shadows weren't natural. They weren't simply the absence of light. They were something else entirely. They moved with a purpose, slithering along the forest floor, weaving between the trees like living things. Noah quickened his pace, his eyes darting from one shifting shadow to the next. His pulse pounded in his ears, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. He had never been afraid of the woods before, but now, an icy dread gripped him, tightening with every step. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Suddenly, the path split into two. He didn't remember there ever being a fork in the trail, but now, Two narrow paths stretched out before him, both disappearing into the darkened forest. Noah stood frozen, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning the shadowy trails. Each path seemed to beckon him, pulling him in different directions. But there was something strange about the shadows on the left path. They were darker, thicker, almost tangible. He took the path to the right, hoping to avoid whatever lay in the other direction. But as soon as he stepped onto the trail, the forest around him seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above him, blocking out the light entirely. The shadows grew longer, deeper, twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Noah felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He wasn't alone. The shadows moved with him, always just at the edge of his vision. He could feel them watching, waiting. Every now and then, he caught a glimpse of something in the darkness, a flicker of movement, a shape darting between the trees. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. The trail wound deeper into the forest, growing narrower and more overgrown with each step. The underbrush clawed at his legs, and the trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches forming a claustrophobic cage. His breath quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. Then, without warning, the path ended. He stood at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by a circle of ancient trees. The shadows here were different, thicker, darker than anywhere else. They clung to the ground like a living, pulsating mass, shifting and swirling in a way that made Noah's skin crawl. It was as though the shadows themselves were alive. He hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure of what to do. The shadows seemed to be waiting for him, beckoning him forward. His gut screamed at him to turn back, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, trapped by the weight of the silence and the oppressive darkness. As he stood there, staring into the abyss of shadows, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a faint shape, a ripple in the darkness. But slowly, it grew clearer, a figure, cloaked in shadow, rising from the ground like a phantom. It had no discernible features, no face, no body, just a vague, humanoid form made of pure darkness. Noah's breath caught in his throat. His limbs felt heavy, paralyzed by fear. The shadow figure stood motionless in the center of the clearing, its presence filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. It didn't move, but Noah could feel its eyes, if it had eyes, boring into him, as though it were studying him, waiting for something. And then, without warning, the figure began to move. It glided toward him, soundless and fluid, its form shifting and twisting with every step. The shadows around it writhed and pulsed, following its movements like a pack of ravenous beasts. Noah's mind screamed at him to run, to flee, but his body refused to obey. He stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, watching in terror as the shadow figure drew closer. The air around him grew colder, the shadows darker, more oppressive. Just as the figure was about to reach him, it stopped. It hovered just inches from Noah, its formless face mere centimeters from his own. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the thick, suffocating darkness. Then, without warning, the shadow figure lunged forward. It passed through Noah like a gust of freezing wind, its touch cold and numbing. He gasped, stumbling backward, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he turned around, the shadow figure was gone. The clearing was empty, the shadows retreating back into the forest. The oppressive silence remained, but the sense of dread had lifted, if only slightly. Noah stood there for what felt like an eternity, his breath ragged, his body trembling. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. The shadows weren't just illusions of the light. They were alive, sentient, and they had chosen to spare him. For now. Chapter 7. The Ascent. The mountain rose before Mara, its jagged peaks biting into the sky, dark clouds swirling around the summit like a crown of mist. She had come here every year since she was a child, each time climbing a little higher, but today felt different. The air was colder, thinner, and the wind howled as if the mountain itself was alive, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. The path leading up was steep and uneven, the ground littered with loose rocks and patches of slick moss. Mara adjusted her pack, feeling the familiar weight pressing against her shoulders as she took her first step. The ascent would be grueling, but she had always found solace in the climb, in the slow, methodical rhythm of her footsteps. Today, however, there was an unsettling tension in the air. The wind tugged at her hair, biting at her exposed skin as she climbed higher. With every step, the ground beneath her seemed to shift and tremble, as if the mountain was waking from a long slumber. Mara ignored it at first, chalking it up to nerves or exhaustion. But the higher she climbed, the more she realized something was wrong. There were no birds, no signs of life. The usual sounds of the mountain, the distant cry of an eagle, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, were absent. Only the wind remained, howling with an almost mournful tone, as if it were carrying the voices of the dead. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she reached a narrow ridge, a precarious section of the climb that required careful footing. The cliff dropped off sharply on one side, the rocks below sharp and jagged. She steadied herself, planting her hands on the rough stone for balance. The sky above darkened, and the clouds thickened, swirling faster now, as if drawn to the peak of the mountain. Mara pressed on, her legs burning with the strain of the climb. The wind grew stronger, pushing against her as if trying to force her back, but she continued upward, determined. The path wound around a series of crumbling boulders, leading her to a small plateau nestled between two towering rock faces. It was a place she had never reached before. As she stood on the plateau, catching her breath, a strange sensation washed over her. The air here felt different, thicker, heavier. It clung to her like a shroud, and with it came a sense of profound unease. The mountain was no longer just a mountain. It felt alive, its presence looming over her, watching her every move. Mara's eyes drifted upward to the summit. It was close now, but something about it filled her with dread. She had always wanted to reach the top, to stand on the peak and look out over the world below. But now, the idea of doing so felt wrong. There was something waiting for her up there. Something ancient, something terrible. A sudden gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet, sending small stones skittering across the plateau. Mara braced herself, gripping the edge of a boulder for support. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time, she considered turning back. But as she looked down at the path she had taken, the way back seemed impossibly far, as if the mountain itself had shifted beneath her. No turning back. She had come this far, and there was no choice but to continue. The final ascent was brutal. The rocks were loose and jagged, the path barely visible beneath the swirling mist. Mara climbed with her hands now, pulling herself over ledges and crags, her fingers raw and bleeding from the rough stone. The wind howled louder, as if screaming in protest at her approach. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the summit. The peak was a narrow, uneven space, surrounded by sheer cliffs on all sides. Mara stood at the edge, her legs trembling with exhaustion, and looked out at the world below. But there was nothing to see. The clouds had descended, blanketing everything in a thick, impenetrable fog. She could barely see her own feet, let alone the valley below. For a long moment, she stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for something to happen. But the wind had died down now, replaced by an eerie stillness. The summit was silent, deathly quiet. And then she felt it, a presence, just behind her, cold and oppressive. It pressed against her back, wrapping around her like a shadow, and the hairs on her neck stood on end. Slowly, Mara turned. There, standing at the very edge of the cliff, was a figure. Its shape was vague, indistinct, as if it were part of the mist itself. It had no face, no features, just a black void where a person should be. The air around it seemed to shimmer and distort, as if reality was bending to accommodate its presence. Mara's heart raced, her body frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the summit with a crushing sense of dread. It was as if the mountain itself had manifested in human form, an ancient spirit born from the stone and wind, come to claim her for daring to climb so high. She took a step back, her foot slipping on the uneven ground, and her stomach lurched as she glanced over the edge of the cliff. One wrong move, and she would plummet to her death. But the figure remained motionless, watching her. If it even had eyes to watch with, Mara knew she couldn't stay here. The presence was growing stronger, more oppressive with each passing second. She could feel it pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and her vision began to blur. In a blind panic, she turned and began her descent. Her legs wobbled beneath her, her hands trembling as she grabbed onto the rocks for support. The path down was even more treacherous than the climb up, the wind picking up again, pushing against her, as if trying to throw her off the mountain. The figure remained at the summit, watching her as she fled, but it didn't follow. It didn't need to. Mara didn't stop until she reached the safety of the lower plateau. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. The presence was gone now, but the sense of dread remained, lingering in the air like a shadow. She had reached the summit, but something had followed her down, and she knew, deep in her bones, that it wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 8. The Reflection. The lake stretched out before Arlo, still and silent, its glassy surface reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the shore, but the water remained untouched by the wind, as if frozen in time. Arlo stood at the water's edge, staring at the reflection of the sky and the trees, and at the reflection of himself, small, distorted, but unmistakable. The lake had always been a place of quiet solitude for him, a sanctuary from the world, but today, there was something off about it. He had grown up in this small, forgotten town, where the lake had been the centerpiece of his childhood adventures. Swimming, fishing, long summer days spent lying on the shore, gazing up at the clouds. It had been his escape, but now, as an adult, the lake seemed different, as if it had changed in his absence. The trees on the far side loomed larger, darker, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural ways. The water, once inviting, now appeared black and bottomless, a void that stretched far deeper than he remembered. Arlo crouched at the edge of the shore, dipping his fingers into the water. It was cold, colder than it should have been for this time of year. He withdrew his hand quickly, wiping it on his jeans, the chill lingering in his bones. Something about the lake unsettled him, a quiet wrongness that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The reflection of the sky and the water shifted, the clouds darkening as the sun dipped lower behind the treeline. For a moment, Arlo thought he saw something in the reflection, a flicker of movement, a shadow darting beneath the surface. He blinked, his heart skipping a beat, but when he looked again, the water was still. Just his imagination, he told himself. But as the minutes passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Arlo straightened, his eyes scanning the treeline across the lake. The woods were thick, dense with undergrowth, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, just the trees standing tall and silent. He stepped closer to the water, peering down at his reflection once more. The image in the water was darker now, the fading light casting everything in shades of gray. His face looked tired, older than he felt, the lines around his eyes deeper, his expression haunted. He had come here for peace, but the lake offered none. Instead, it seemed to hold secrets, secrets it was not yet ready to share. Suddenly, the surface of the water rippled. A small, concentric wave spread out from the center, distorting the reflection. Arlo frowned. There was no wind, no fish breaking the surface, no reason for the water to move. Yet the ripple grew larger, spreading outward in perfect circles, as if something had disturbed the lake from below. He took a cautious step back, his pulse quickening. The ripple expanded, reaching the shore in front of him, but the water remained eerily calm, the surface still reflecting the sky. Arlo stared at the point where the ripple had begun, waiting for something to emerge, but nothing came. The lake was silent once more. Then he saw it. In the reflection, his own face began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but with growing clarity, the reflection warped. His eyes widened in horror as the image of himself in the water shifted, twisting into something unrecognizable. His features melted, elongating and darkening, his eyes hollowing out until they were nothing but black pits. His mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin, teeth sharp and gleaming. It wasn't him anymore. It was something else, something wearing his face like a mask. Arlo's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled at his sides, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a rock, and he nearly fell. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from the water. The reflection, his twisted, distorted double, was moving now, but he wasn't. The figure in the water slowly raised its hand, reaching toward him, fingers long and skeletal, as if trying to break through the surface of the lake. Arlo's heart pounded in his chest, his body frozen in place. The reflection's grin widened, impossibly wide, stretching across its face like a rictus of pure malice. Without thinking, Arlo turned and ran. His boots pounded against the soft earth as he fled from the shore, his breath ragged in his chest. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the woods, ducking behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree. His chest heaved with exertion, and he pressed his back against the rough bark, trying to steady his breathing. For a long moment, he stood there, the only sound the pounding of his heart and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Slowly, he dared to peek around the tree, his eyes scanning the lake. It was calm again. The water, smooth and undisturbed, reflected the sky as it always had. There was no ripple, no movement, and the reflection of the trees and clouds was perfectly normal. He couldn't see his own reflection from this distance, but the image of that twisted, grinning face lingered in his mind, as vivid as if it were still staring back at him. Arlo swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had grown up near this lake, had spent countless hours by its shore, but now it felt foreign to him, alien, as if something had awoken beneath its surface, something that had been waiting for him all these years. He couldn't stay here, not anymore. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. He froze, his body tensing. Slowly, he turned back toward the lake. There, standing at the water's edge, was a figure. It was indistinct, shrouded in shadow, its form barely visible in the fading light. But Arlo knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was watching him. It was standing exactly where he had been just moments ago, staring out at the lake, its gaze fixed on the water. Or was it staring at him? Arlo's breath hitched, his legs shaking beneath him. He didn't wait to find out. Without looking back, he bolted into the woods, the trees closing in around him as he ran. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Behind him, the lake remained still, its surface unbroken, reflecting the darkening sky and the twisted shapes of the trees. But something else lurked beneath the water, something that had seen him, and something that would not forget. And as Arlo disappeared into the forest, the reflection on the lake shifted once more, the water rippling as if disturbed by something deep below, something that was still watching. Chapter 9. The Descent. The narrow stairway spiraled down into darkness, the stone steps slick with moisture and worn smooth from centuries of footsteps. At the top of the stairs, a single lantern flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows on the cold walls. Maddox paused at the threshold, staring into the void below, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. The air that rose from the depths was damp, stale, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. He had always known this place existed, hidden beneath the old mansion, but until today, he had never dared to venture down. It was a place whispered about in town, a place where no one returned from. Yet here he stood, his curiosity overwhelming the gnawing fear in his gut. There was something he had to know, something that had haunted him for years, and the answers lay in the shadows below. Taking a deep breath, Maddox descended. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very weight of the darkness was pressing down on him. The stone walls closed in, damp and cold against his fingertips as he trailed his hand along them for balance. The air thickened, growing colder the deeper he went, the lantern's flame sputtering with each breath of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The light barely pierced the shadows, but it was enough to show him the path ahead. The stairwell twisted and turned, narrowing as it plunged deeper into the earth. Maddox's footsteps echoed in the tight space, a hollow sound that seemed to be swallowed by the silence. There was no sound of life down here, no distant murmur of voices, no creak of floorboards above, not even the scurrying of rats. Only his own ragged breathing, the soft scrape of his boots on stone, and the flicker of the lantern as it fought against the encroaching darkness. Finally, the stairs ended, and Maddox found himself at the entrance of a vast underground chamber. The lantern's feeble glow barely touched the edges of the room, but he could make out the high ceiling, arched and lined with ancient carvings. Symbols and figures, worn with age and covered in layers of grime, stared down at him, their empty eyes seeming to follow his every movement. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, weathered and cracked, with chains dangling from its sides. The sight of it sent a shiver down Maddox's spine. He had heard stories, vague, terrifying rumors about what had taken place here long ago. Sacrifices, rituals, things that shouldn't have been. But seeing the altar in person, standing in the very place where those unspeakable acts had occurred, made the reality of it all too clear. His gaze drifted to the floor, where deep grooves had been carved into the stone, forming a wide circle around the altar. The grooves were filled with a dark substance, dried, flaking, but unmistakably blood. Maddox's throat tightened as he crouched to get a closer look. The blood wasn't fresh, but it wasn't ancient either. Someone had been here recently. He stood up quickly, the lantern trembling in his grip. His instinct screamed at him to leave, to turn back before it was too late, but something held him there, rooted to the spot. He couldn't explain it. A pull, a compulsion that drew him closer to the altar. His mind screamed in protest, but his body moved on its own, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the room. The closer he got to the altar, the more the air seemed to thrum with energy. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone and up into his bones. The walls seemed to pulse, the symbols on them shifting and twisting as if alive. The chains hanging from the altar rattled softly, though there was no breeze. Maddox stopped in front of the altar, his heart pounding in his ears. The lantern flickered, its flame growing dimmer, but it still provided just enough light to reveal what lay atop the stone slab. A single object rested there, small and unassuming. An old, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and worn, the edges frayed, but it emanated a strange aura, as if it was more than just a book. Maddox stared at it for a long moment, feeling the pull of it, stronger now, almost overwhelming. His hand hovered over the book, trembling, before he finally touched it. The moment his fingers brushed the leather, a shock ran through him, like a bolt of electricity. The lantern's flame snuffed out, plunging the chamber into total darkness. Maddox gasped, stumbling back, his heart racing as the air around him grew thick and oppressive. He could feel it now. Something was here, something ancient and powerful, lurking in the shadows just beyond his reach. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow and ragged as he fumbled in the dark. His hands shook as he reached for the lantern, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't reignite the flame. Panic rose in his chest, his mind racing as the darkness seemed to close in around him. And then, he heard it, a faint, almost inaudible whisper, like a breath of wind brushing past his ear. The sound sent a jolt of terror through him, freezing him in place. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't human, but it was something. Something alive. Something watching. Maddox backed away from the altar, his hands groping blindly for the walls of the chamber. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around him like a cold fog. He could feel it in his bones now, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the air. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, the stone groaning as if it were alive. His foot caught on something, and he stumbled, falling hard onto the cold floor. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide and searching in the pitch blackness. The whisper was all around him now, a cacophony of sounds that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. And then, without warning, the chamber fell silent. The air grew still, heavy with the weight of anticipation. Maddox stood frozen, his body trembling, every nerve on edge. Suddenly, a soft glow appeared in the darkness. It wasn't the lantern. No, this light came from the altar. Maddox turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he saw it. The book. It was glowing, faintly at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. The strange symbols on its cover pulsed with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. Maddox took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The pull of the book was stronger now, almost irresistible. He could feel it calling to him, urging him closer. His hand reached out, fingers brushing the air between him and the glowing tome. And then, the light exploded. Blinding, searing light filled the chamber, and Maddox threw his hands up to shield his eyes. The force of it knocked him back, sending him sprawling across the floor. The air crackled with energy, and the whisper returned, louder now, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. Maddox lay there, gasping for breath, the world spinning around him. He could feel the presence now, stronger than ever, a malevolent force that had been waiting for him, waiting for this moment. And as the light began to fade, he knew with a sickening certainty that he was no longer alone in the chamber. Chapter 10. The Halls of Echoes. The manor stood at the edge of the forest, its towering silhouette a dark blot against the twilight sky. It had been abandoned for decades, a relic of a bygone era, and yet it still loomed large in the collective memory of the town. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging, and ivy clung to the walls like a green shroud. Tonight, however, the manor was not entirely silent. Inside, the air was thick with dust and neglect. The grand foyer, once a testament to opulence, was now a cavernous space filled with cobwebs and debris. The once grand chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dull and covered in grime. The silence was palpable, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards and the occasional flutter of dust motes in the dim light filtering through gaps in the boarded-up windows. Eva entered the manor, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. She carried a flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow swath through the darkness. The light revealed the grandeur of the place. Marble columns, intricate moldings, and faded murals on the walls, now marred by years of decay and disrepair. As Eva moved deeper into the house, the once stately decor became increasingly fractured. The grand staircase, which once led to the upper floors with regal elegance, was now a rotting skeleton of its former self. The banister was splintered, and the once carpeted steps were bare, exposing the rough wood underneath. Each step she took seemed to echo through the empty halls, her footsteps reverberating with an unnerving clarity. She made her way through a series of interconnected rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. The parlors and drawing rooms were filled with broken furniture, torn drapes, and remnants of a past life. Portraits of long-forgotten inhabitants hung crookedly on the walls, their faces obscured by dust and shadow. The eyes of these portraits seemed to follow her, their gaze unsettling in the stillness. In one room, she discovered a library. The shelves were lined with old books, their spines cracked and yellowed. The air was musty with the scent of old paper and mildew. Eva moved methodically, shining her flashlight on the titles, but none of the books seemed particularly interesting. She was looking for something more specific, something that had drawn her to the manor in the first place. The library led to a corridor lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. Eva chose one at random and pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom, furnished with a large four-poster bed draped in tattered curtains. The bed was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the real interest lay in the desk against the far wall. The desk was cluttered with papers, old letters, and a large, leather-bound journal. Eva approached it carefully, her flashlight illuminating the objects. The journal's cover was embossed with a crest, its gold leaf faded and worn. She opened it slowly, revealing pages of neat handwriting. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. The entries spoke of the manor's history, its construction, the family who had lived there, and the strange occurrences that had begun to plague them. The last few pages were hastily written, the handwriting jagged and frantic. They spoke of an artifact hidden somewhere in the house, something of great power that had to be protected at all costs. Eva's heart raced as she read. The description of the artifact matched what she had been searching for. A relic said to hold the key to understanding the strange events that had plagued the town for years. She closed the journal carefully, her mind racing with possibilities. Leaving the bedroom, she continued down the corridor, the journal's revelation weighing heavily on her. The manor seemed to grow colder, the air thickening with each step. The beams of her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The hallway ended in a door, slightly ajar, leading to a spiral staircase descending further into the bowels of the house. Eva hesitated for a moment, her flashlight revealing a long drop into darkness. The staircase looked old and treacherous, but there was no other way to proceed. With a deep breath, she began her descent. The steps were narrow and uneven, and each one creaked ominously under her weight. The darkness grew more profound as she went lower, the only light coming from the flashlight's beam, which seemed to dissipate into the void. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a large subterranean chamber. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, unpleasant odor. The chamber was filled with old, dusty crates and barrels, their contents long forgotten. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate chest, its surface covered in intricate carvings. Eva approached the chest cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the carvings. They depicted scenes of ritualistic ceremonies, strange symbols, and figures that seemed almost otherworldly. The chest was locked, the heavy iron padlock rusted and corroded with age. She retrieved a set of tools from her bag and worked on the padlock, her hands steady despite the growing sense of anticipation. After a few minutes of effort, the padlock clicked open, and the chest's lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside the chest was an assortment of objects, candles, ritualistic implements, and an old, weathered book. The book was bound in a dark, leather-like material, its cover adorned with strange symbols that matched those on the chest. Eva's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the book, feeling a chill run down her spine. She opened the book carefully, revealing pages filled with arcane symbols and illustrations of strange rituals. The text was written in an ancient, unreadable script, but the images spoke of powerful ceremonies and forbidden knowledge. As Eva studied the book, a cold draft swept through the chamber, causing the candles to flicker and casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a low, mournful sound began to fill the room, as if the house itself were groaning in protest. Eva looked around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The shadows seemed to dance and shift, creating distorted shapes that moved with a life of their own. The sense of unease grew stronger, the atmosphere charged with a palpable energy. The book felt heavy in her hands, its weight pressing down on her. She could sense that it was more than just a collection of old writings. It was a conduit to something much darker, something that had been sealed away for a reason. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and Eva could not shake the sensation that she was no longer alone. She closed the book, her mind racing with the implications of what she had found. The manor seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. With a final, lingering glance at the chest and its contents, she turned and made her way back to the staircase, the echo of her footsteps mingling with the mournful sound that filled the chamber. As she climbed the stairs, the air grew warmer, the oppressive atmosphere slowly lifting. She emerged into the main foyer, the grand space once again illuminated by the dim light from the boarded-up windows. The manor was silent now, but the sense of unease remained, a reminder of the dark secrets it held. Eva left the manor, stepping out into the cool night air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery light over the grounds. She glanced back at the house, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. The journey had revealed much, but there was still so much more to uncover. The book, the artifact, and the manor itself held secrets that had to be understood. And as she walked away, she knew that her search was far from over. The halls of the manor had whispered their warnings, and she had heard them. The echoes of the past would not be easily silenced. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Sanctuary. The dense forest surrounding the manor was an impenetrable wall of shadows and tangled undergrowth. It seemed to close in around Celine as she navigated her way through the thick foliage. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves and moss. The forest floor was uneven, covered in a thick layer of fallen branches and leaves that crunched underfoot. Celine had been searching for hours, guided only by a cryptic map she had found in an old book in the manor's library. The map was faded and worn, its edges frayed, but it had led her to this point, a specific location deep within the forest. According to the map, an ancient sanctuary lay hidden here, shrouded in secrecy and forgotten by time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Celine's flashlight cut a narrow path through the gloom as she followed the map's directions, her heart racing with anticipation. The map indicated that the sanctuary was located at the base of a large, ancient oak tree, one that had stood for centuries. She scanned the area for the tree, its distinctive features described in detail on the map. After what felt like an eternity, she spotted it. A colossal oak, its gnarled branches sprawling out in all directions. The tree was enormous, its trunk thick and covered in patches of moss. It was as if nature itself had been preserving it for something significant. Celine approached it cautiously, her flashlight revealing an inscription carved into the bark. The inscription was partially obscured by moss and time, but the faint outlines of symbols and words were still visible. Celine traced the carvings with her fingers, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The symbols matched those she had seen in the book, confirming that she was in the right place. At the base of the tree, partially hidden by undergrowth, was a small stone slab. Celine cleared away the leaves and dirt, revealing a set of intricate carvings that matched the ones on the tree. The slab had a faint glow about it, as if it were imbued with an otherworldly energy. Celine examined the carvings closely. They depicted a series of geometric shapes and symbols arranged in a specific pattern. She remembered seeing similar patterns in the old manuscripts, which had hinted at hidden chambers and forgotten relics. The slab appeared to be a key or a puzzle, designed to unlock something hidden beneath it. With careful precision, she began to work on the carvings, pressing and turning the stone in various ways. The process was slow and meticulous, her hands moving with practiced skill. After several minutes of effort, she heard a soft click as the slab shifted, revealing a narrow opening below. Celine peered into the opening, which descended into darkness. The air that emerged was cool and musty, carrying a faint scent of old earth and decay. She shone her flashlight into the void, revealing a set of stone steps leading downward. The steps were narrow and uneven, and the walls of the passage were lined with ancient carvings similar to those on the slab. Taking a deep breath, Celine descended the steps, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The passage was damp and the air grew colder as she moved further underground. The walls seemed to close in, and the passage curved, leading her deeper into the earth. The passageway eventually opened into a large subterranean chamber. The space was vast, the ceiling high and supported by ancient stone columns. The chamber was filled with strange, glowing crystals embedded in the walls, their light casting an ethereal glow throughout the room. The ground was covered in a thick layer of fine, white dust, undisturbed except for Celine's footprints. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, much like the one she had seen in the manor, but larger and more elaborate. The altar was surrounded by a circle of strange symbols, etched deeply into the stone floor. The symbols glowed faintly, their light pulsing rhythmically. On the altar lay a series of artifacts, ancient relics and ceremonial objects, each intricately crafted and arranged with care. There were ornate daggers, decorated with precious stones, and golden chalices, their surfaces etched with arcane symbols. At the center of the altar was a large, open book, its pages filled with handwritten texts and illustrations of strange rituals. Celine approached the altar cautiously, her flashlight revealing more details of the artifacts. The book's pages were filled with complex diagrams and illustrations of ceremonies that seemed to be both ritualistic and symbolic. The text, written in an ancient language, spoke of powers and entities that were both revered and feared. She reached out and carefully turned the pages, her eyes scanning the intricate details. The book detailed the history of the sanctuary, its purpose as a place of worship and protection for a powerful artifact. According to the text, the sanctuary was built to guard the artifact from those who sought to misuse its power. As Celine examined the artifacts and the book, she noticed a faint, rhythmic vibration in the chamber. It was as if the sanctuary itself were alive, pulsing with an ancient energy. The air grew colder, and a low hum filled the space, growing louder with each passing moment. Celine could sense that something was about to happen, a shift in the atmosphere that signaled the awakening of something dormant. The glow of the crystals intensified, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The symbols on the floor began to glow more brightly, their light merging into a single, pulsating source. She stepped back from the altar, her flashlight flickering as the energy in the room built to a crescendo. The vibrations grew stronger, causing the ground beneath her feet to tremble. The air was charged with a palpable energy, and Celine could feel the weight of the sanctuary's power pressing down on her. The artifacts on the altar began to shift, their positions changing as if guided by an invisible force. The book's pages turned rapidly, stopping at a specific illustration that seemed to glow with an intense, otherworldly light. The energy in the room reached its peak, and Celine felt a surge of raw power enveloping her. In a blinding flash, the chamber was filled with light. Celine shielded her eyes, her heart racing as the light faded. When she looked up again, the artifacts were in their original positions, and the room had returned to its previous, eerie stillness. Celine stood in the center of the chamber, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The energy had dissipated, leaving her feeling both exhilarated and drained. The sanctuary had revealed its secrets, but the true nature of its power remained elusive. As she made her way back to the passage, Celine took one last look at the chamber. The sanctuary had fulfilled its purpose, protecting its secrets from those who sought to uncover them. The symbols on the floor and the glowing crystals had all returned to their dormant state, but the sense of ancient power lingered in the air. Emerging from the sanctuary, Celine retraced her steps through the forest, the night air cool against her skin. The forest seemed more alive now, the sounds of nocturnal creatures filling the silence. The manor loomed in the distance, its dark windows watching her as she made her way back. The discovery of the sanctuary had opened new avenues of exploration and understanding. Celine knew that there was much more to uncover, and that the sanctuary was only one piece of a larger puzzle. The ancient relics and the book had provided valuable insight, but the true nature of the artifact and its power remained to be explored. As she left the forest behind and headed back to the manor, Celine's mind was filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. The journey had only just begun, and the mysteries of the past awaited her in the darkness. Chapter 12: The Shattered Mirror. The town was shrouded in a dense fog that rolled in from the nearby sea. The mist clung to the streets and houses, transforming the familiar landscape into a ghostly tableau. As the fog thickened, it became difficult to discern the outlines of buildings, and streetlights cast eerie halos through the mist. Catherine walked down the fog-covered main street, her footsteps muffled by the damp ground. She was drawn to an old, forgotten antique shop that had recently caught her attention. The shop's faded sign hung crookedly above the door, barely legible through the thick fog. The building itself was an old, dilapidated structure, its once vibrant paint now peeling and weathered. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood and aged paper. The shelves were crammed with an assortment of antiques, old clocks, tarnished silverware, and faded paintings, all coated in layers of dust. Catherine's eyes were drawn to a large, ornate mirror leaning against the back wall. The mirror's frame was intricately carved with floral patterns and gilded with gold leaf. Despite the dust and grime, the mirror's surface retained a faint sheen, hinting at its former grandeur. She approached the mirror cautiously, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet shop. The mirror was large and imposing, its reflective surface marred by smudges and scratches. As she drew closer, she noticed that the reflection was distorted, the image wavering and uneven. Catherine reached out to touch the mirror's frame, her fingers brushing against the cold, dusty surface. The mirror's reflection seemed to shift and ripple, as if reacting to her presence. She leaned in closer, peering into the distorted image, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The reflection showed not only her own image but also glimpses of scenes from the past, faded and fragmented visions of the shop in a different time. She saw glimpses of people who had once stood in this very place, their faces blurred and indistinct. The reflections shifted and changed, each image more elusive than the last. As Catherine studied the mirror, she noticed that the reflection was becoming more chaotic. The images swirled and twisted, the colors blending into a confusing mosaic. It was as if the mirror was trying to convey something, but the message was obscured by its own imperfections. Suddenly, the mirror's surface began to crack. Fine lines appeared, spreading across the glass like a spider's web. The cracks grew larger, spreading outward from the center of the mirror. Catherine stepped back, her heart pounding as the mirror's surface continued to shatter. The cracks expanded rapidly, and with a loud, shattering noise, the mirror's surface broke into 1,000 fragments. The glass fell to the floor in a shower of sharp, jagged pieces. The fragments scattered across the wooden floor, reflecting the flickering light bulb in fractured patterns. Catherine stood in stunned silence, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of the shattered mirror. The fragments lay scattered on the floor, each piece reflecting a different portion of the room. The once distorted reflection was now completely broken, the image lost among the shards. She carefully stepped around the broken glass, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The mirror's destruction seemed to have released something, a change in the atmosphere, a shift in the energy of the room. The shop felt different now, as if the mirror had been holding something back. As she looked at the scattered pieces of glass, Catherine noticed that some of the fragments were strangely smooth and clear, their edges glinting in the dim light. She picked up one of the larger shards, examining it closely. The shard was pristine, its surface free of the distortions that had plagued the mirror. The shard showed a clear, unblemished reflection of the shop. The image was crisp and detailed, without the previous distortions. It was as if the shard was offering a glimpse into a different reality, one that was more coherent and stable than the shattered mirror had been. Catherine collected several of the shards, carefully placing them in a small cloth bag she had brought with her. Each shard provided a different perspective on the room, and she was determined to understand the significance of the shattered mirror. With the shards safely secured, Catherine turned her attention to the shop. The atmosphere felt lighter, less oppressive than before. The sense of disturbance that had pervaded the space seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a calm, almost serene ambience. She took one last look around the shop, her gaze lingering on the broken mirror frame now empty and forlorn. The shop, once filled with an air of mystery and unease, now seemed like a simple, ordinary place. The shattered mirror had changed everything, revealing a new layer of reality that was both fascinating and unsettling. As Catherine left the shop, the fog outside had begun to lift, revealing a clearer view of the town. The misty veil that had obscured the streets was slowly receding, and the once distant buildings now appeared more defined and tangible. The shards of the mirror were tucked safely in her bag, a tangible reminder of the experience she had just undergone. Catherine knew that the broken mirror was not just an ordinary artifact. It was a gateway to something more profound, a clue to a mystery that was still unfolding. As she walked away from the antique shop, the fog continued to lift, and the night air felt cooler and more refreshing. The mirror's shattered reflections had revealed glimpses of something hidden, and Catherine was determined to uncover the truth behind the fragments. The journey was far from over, and the shattered mirror was only one piece of the larger puzzle that lay ahead. Chapter 13. The Gilded Cage. The old mansion stood on a hill overlooking the city, its once grand facade now weathered and forlorn. The house was surrounded by a high iron fence, its gate rusted and slightly ajar. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, and the overgrown garden was choked with weeds and tangled vines. Under a cloudy sky, Alex approached the mansion, the weight of a long-forgotten key in his pocket. He had come across an old journal in a library sale, its pages filled with cryptic notes and sketches. One entry mentioned a hidden room in the mansion, accessed by a specific key. Intrigued, Alex had located the key among a collection of antique trinkets, its intricate design hinting at its importance. He pushed open the creaking gate and made his way up the overgrown path to the mansion's front door. The door was large and imposing, with a faded, ornate design that spoke of a bygone era. Alex inserted the key into the lock, turning it slowly. The lock clicked open with a satisfying sound, and he pushed the heavy door ajar. Inside, the mansion was a maze of dusty rooms and cobweb-covered furniture. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The once grand foyer was now a shadow of its former self, with faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and tarnished chandeliers hanging precariously from the ceiling. Alex explored the first few rooms, each one filled with remnants of the past. Old portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him, antique furniture draped in white sheets, and dusty bookshelves lined with yellowed volumes. The mansion's once elegant decor was now a testament to years of neglect. He followed the directions from the journal, making his way through the mansion's labyrinthine hallways. The further he ventured, the more the house seemed to close in around him. The air grew colder, and the floorboards creaked underfoot with an ominous groan. Eventually, Alex arrived at a small, hidden door at the end of a long corridor. The door was made of heavy oak, adorned with intricate carvings of vines and flowers. According to the journal, this was the entrance to the hidden room. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room bathed in a soft, golden glow. The room was filled with an assortment of unusual items, strange artifacts, ornate furniture, and gilded frames holding faded photographs. But what caught Alex's attention was the centerpiece of the room. A large, ornate birdcage standing in the center, its metal bars intricately wrought with delicate patterns. The birdcage was empty, its base lined with a plush velvet cushion that had long since faded to a dull gray. The cage was suspended from the ceiling by a chain, its motionless stillness giving it an air of silent melancholy. The cage seemed to dominate the room, its grandeur overshadowing the other objects within. Alex approached the birdcage, inspecting it closely. The metalwork was exquisite, the bars twisted into elaborate designs that caught the light and cast intricate shadows on the walls. The cage's door was slightly ajar, as if someone had just recently left it open. He noticed that the velvet cushion inside the cage was covered in a series of delicate, handwritten notes. The notes were yellowed with age and seemed to be filled with a mixture of poetic musings and cryptic messages. The words were faded, but certain phrases stood out, hinting at a story of confinement and longing. As he read the notes, Alex began to piece together a narrative. The notes spoke of a woman who had once been imprisoned in the cage, her life marked by a sense of isolation and despair. The writing hinted at a deep sense of sorrow and a yearning for freedom, but also a resignation to her fate. The room was filled with other relics that seemed to tell a similar story. There were old diaries, faded photographs, and a collection of jewelry, all belonging to the same woman. Each item seemed to carry a fragment of her life, creating a portrait of someone who had been trapped in both a physical and emotional cage. As Alex explored the room further, he noticed a small, hidden compartment in the wall. He pried it open, revealing a collection of old keys and a small, ornate box. The box was intricately decorated with gold leaf and precious stones, its surface covered in delicate patterns. He opened the box, revealing a single item inside, a beautiful antique locket. The locket was adorned with intricate filigree and had a small, glass window on one side. Inside the window was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman with a melancholic expression. The locket felt heavy in his hand, its significance palpable. It seemed to hold a piece of the woman's story, a tangible connection to her past. Alex carefully placed the locket back in the box and closed it, his mind racing with thoughts of the woman who had been confined in the birdcage. The room felt different now, as if the weight of the woman's sorrow had settled into the very fabric of the space. The gilded cage, once a symbol of opulence and grandeur, now seemed like a grim reminder of a life constrained by unseen bars. Alex took one last look around the room, absorbing the somber atmosphere. The birdcage and its contents had revealed a fragment of a story long forgotten, a glimpse into the life of someone who had once lived within the mansion's walls. As he left the hidden room, the heavy door closing behind him, Alex felt a sense of both closure and unease. The birdcage and its artifacts had provided a window into a past filled with sadness and longing. The mansion, once a place of mystery, had now given up one of its secrets. With the birdcage's story etched in his mind, Alex retraced his steps through the mansion, the weight of the locket and the notes lingering in his thoughts. The mansion's shadows seemed to hold a deeper meaning now, and the story of the gilded cage would remain with him as he left the house behind. The fog had lifted outside, and the sky was clear as Alex emerged from the mansion. The town lay sprawled below him, its streets and buildings bathed in the light of the setting sun. The once hidden room and its secrets had been revealed, but the story was far from over. The mansion's history was rich and layered, and Alex knew that there were more mysteries to uncover in the shadows of the past. Chapter 14. The Silent Orchestra. The Grand Theater was a majestic structure, its once gleaming facade now dulled by years of neglect. The building, with its towering columns and ornate carvings, loomed in the heart of the city, its grandeur hinting at a more illustrious past. The theater had long been closed, its doors sealed and its windows boarded up, but a small, unnoticed side entrance had remained ajar, offering a rare glimpse into its forgotten interior. Amelia, drawn by the allure of the old theater, entered through the side door and stepped into the dimly lit foyer. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of aged wood and old velvet. The once gleaming chandeliers hung motionless from the ceiling, their crystals covered in a layer of grime. She moved through the foyer, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. The walls were adorned with faded posters of past performances, their colors muted and worn. The grandeur of the theater was evident even in its decay, with intricate moldings and faded murals decorating the walls. Amelia made her way toward the main auditorium, passing through heavy, velvet-draped doors that creaked as she pushed them open. The auditorium was vast and cavernous, its high ceiling adorned with elaborate plasterwork and golden accents. Rows of once luxurious seating were now covered in dust, their upholstery worn and threadbare. At the center of the stage stood a grand, old-fashioned orchestra pit. The pit was empty, save for a collection of dust-covered instruments, violins, cellos, and flutes, arranged in disarray. The instruments seemed almost ghostly in the dim light, their polished surfaces dulled by years of neglect. Amelia descended into the orchestra pit, her steps stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the weak light streaming through the boarded-up windows. She examined the instruments closely, noting their condition and the sense of abandonment that clung to them. One instrument in particular caught her eye, a large, ornate harp, its strings tangled and covered in dust. The harp was positioned at the center of the pit, its golden frame shimmering faintly despite the grime. Amelia approached the harp, her fingers tracing the delicate carvings along its frame. As she touched the harp, she felt a strange sensation, as though the instrument was resonating with an unseen energy. The air around the harp seemed to hum faintly, creating a subtle vibration that she could almost feel through her fingertips. It was as if the harp was waiting for someone to play it, its silent presence a testament to the music that had once filled the theater. Amelia moved on to inspect the other instruments. The violins and cellos were covered in a thick layer of dust, their strings twisted and broken. The flutes were tarnished, their once silver sheen now a dull gray. Each instrument told a story of a time long past, a time when the theater had been alive with music and laughter. She noticed a stack of sheet music scattered on the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle. The music was arranged in neat piles, as if someone had left them behind in a hurry. Amelia carefully picked up a few sheets, studying the faded notes and ornate notations. The music was complex and elegant, a reminder of the talent and skill that had once graced the stage. As she continued to explore the orchestra pit, Amelia discovered a hidden compartment beneath the stage. The compartment was small and dusty, its contents obscured by years of neglect. She pried it open, revealing a collection of old photographs and handwritten notes. The photographs were black and white, depicting scenes from past performances. The images showed the orchestra in full swing, with musicians in elegant attire playing their instruments. The notes were scribbled in a delicate, flowing script detailing rehearsals, performances, and personal reflections. Amelia sifted through the photographs and notes, piecing together the story of the theater's musical past. The notes spoke of a time of great excitement and passion, of talented musicians and memorable performances. The photographs captured moments of joy and artistry, offering a glimpse into a world that had once been vibrant and alive. As she examined the items, Amelia felt a profound sense of connection to the theater's history. The silent orchestra and its instruments, the scattered sheet music, and the forgotten photographs all painted a picture of a bygone era. The theater had once been a place of great beauty and creativity, a sanctuary for music and performance. With a final glance at the orchestra pit, Amelia began to leave the theater. The sense of abandonment and neglect was palpable, but so was the enduring spirit of the music that had once filled the space. The grand theater, though silent now, still held echoes of its past glory. As she walked back through the dimly lit foyer and out into the crisp night air, Amelia carried with her a sense of reverence for the theater's history. The silent orchestra had revealed a piece of its story, a reminder of the music that had once brought life to the grand stage. The theater's legacy, though hidden in the shadows, would continue to resonate through the memories of those who had once been a part of its musical legacy. Chapter 15. The Timekeeper. The clock tower was an imposing structure, standing tall and solitary amidst the cityscape. Its stone walls, covered in ivy and weathered by the elements, seemed to hold the weight of countless years. The clock face, once pristine, was now tarnished and cracked, its hands frozen in time. The tower had been abandoned for decades, its machinery long since fallen into disrepair. Eva approached the clock tower as dusk settled over the city. The air was cool and crisp, and a sense of quiet reverence surrounded the ancient building. She walked around to the rear, where a heavy wooden door, bolstered with iron bands, stood slightly ajar. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the tower was dimly lit by the fading daylight streaming through narrow, dirty windows. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of rust and old wood. The walls were lined with old, yellowed blueprints and sketches of clock mechanisms, their edges curling and fraying with age. Eva ascended the spiral staircase that wound its way up the tower. Each step creaked under her weight, and the narrow stairwell seemed to close in around her as she climbed. The walls of the staircase were lined with various clock parts, gears, springs, and pendulums, all coated in a thick layer of dust. It was as if the tower had been frozen in time, its inner workings left to languish in obscurity. At the top of the staircase, Eva emerged into the clock room. The space was vast and filled with the intricate workings of the clock tower. The room was dominated by the enormous clock mechanism, a marvel of engineering with its brass gears and polished wooden components. The mechanism was silent, its once precise movements now halted. Eva approached the central clock mechanism, its face a grand, ornate piece with Roman numerals and delicate scrollwork. The clock hands, frozen at a specific time, seemed to mock the passage of time itself. The mechanism was a labyrinth of interconnected gears and cogs, all intricately designed to keep the clock ticking. She examined the clock mechanism closely, noting the intricate craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. The gears and cogs were beautifully designed, with elaborate engravings and patterns that spoke of a time when such details were of utmost importance. Despite the dust and rust, the clock's beauty was evident. On a nearby workbench, Eva discovered an assortment of tools and repair parts. The tools were old but well-maintained, their wooden handles polished from years of use. The workbench was covered in blueprints and sketches of clock designs, some annotated with technical notes and calculations. Eva began to investigate the inner workings of the clock mechanism. She carefully removed the dust-covered panels and inspected the gears and springs. Some parts were clearly damaged or worn, while others remained in relatively good condition. It was clear that the clock had been meticulously constructed, but years of neglect had taken their toll. As she worked, Eva found a series of small compartments hidden within the mechanism. Each compartment contained various parts and tools, as well as a collection of old, handwritten notes. The notes were filled with technical details and personal reflections about the clock's construction and maintenance. The notes revealed the story of the clockmaker who had built the tower. The clockmaker had been a meticulous and dedicated craftsman, his notes reflecting a deep passion for his work. He had detailed the challenges he faced and the satisfaction he found in creating something as complex and beautiful as the clock tower. Eva continued her examination, piecing together the history of the clock and its creator. The clockmaker had designed the tower with great care, his goal being to create a timepiece that would stand the test of time. The notes and blueprints revealed the lengths he had gone to ensure the clock's accuracy and reliability. As she worked, Eva felt a growing sense of connection to the clockmaker and his creation. The clock tower, though silent and neglected, held a piece of history that was both fascinating and poignant. The clock's intricate design and the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction were a testament to the dedication and skill of its creator. With a final look at the clock mechanism and the surrounding room, Eva began her descent from the tower. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the city. The clock tower stood as a silent sentinel over the city, its hands frozen in time, but its history still alive in the details of its construction. As she left the tower and walked back into the city, Eva carried with her a sense of appreciation for the clockmaker's work. The clock tower, though no longer functional, was a monument to the passage of time and the skill of those who had sought to master it. The timekeeper's legacy, though hidden in the shadows, would continue to resonate through the history of the city and the stories of its past. Chapter 16. The Forgotten Sanctuary. The old chapel was nestled in a secluded grove on the outskirts of the village, its stone walls partially hidden by the encroaching forest. The chapel, once a place of reverence and solace, now stood silent and forgotten, its grandeur obscured by the passage of time and the growth of ivy and moss. Sophia arrived at the chapel just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the dense canopy of trees. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and fresh foliage. She approached the chapel's entrance, a weathered wooden door partially ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped inside. The interior of the chapel was bathed in a soft, ethereal light that streamed through the stained glass windows. The colors of the glass had faded over time, but they still cast a gentle, multicolored glow across the stone floor. The chapel's once ornate altar was now covered in dust and cobwebs, its intricate carvings barely discernible beneath the grime. Sophia moved down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing softly in the hushed space. The pews, though worn and creaking, were still arranged in orderly rows, as if waiting for a congregation that would never return. The wooden surfaces were carved with names and dates, faded but still legible, a testament to the chapel's past significance. At the far end of the chapel stood a large, intricately carved wooden cross, its surface adorned with delicate floral patterns. The cross was mounted on a raised platform, which was now empty except for a few scattered relics and an old, tarnished candlestick. The once gilded details of the cross had dulled over the years, but it still exuded an air of solemnity. Sophia noticed a small, ornately decorated door at the side of the chapel. It was slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of a narrow, stone staircase leading downward. With curiosity piqued, she carefully made her way to the door and descended the stairs. The passageway below was dimly lit by a few flickering sconces mounted on the walls. The air was cool and musty, and the walls were lined with faded frescoes depicting scenes of pastoral life and religious iconography. The frescoes were peeling and cracked, their once vibrant colors now muted and indistinct. At the bottom of the staircase, Sophia found herself in a small, subterranean chamber. The chamber was sparsely furnished, with a few wooden benches and an old stone altar in the center. The altar was covered in a thick layer of dust, and upon it lay a collection of old, leather-bound books and scrolls. Sophia approached the altar and began to examine the books and scrolls. The books were ancient, their spines cracked and their pages yellowed with age. The texts were written in an old script, their contents mostly indecipherable but clearly significant. The scrolls were rolled up and tied with faded ribbon, their surfaces decorated with intricate symbols and illustrations. As she carefully unrolled one of the scrolls, Sophia discovered a series of detailed diagrams and notes, documenting various rituals and ceremonies. The diagrams depicted elaborate ceremonies that had once been performed in the chapel, including detailed instructions for various rites and offerings. The scrolls also contained references to a series of sacred relics, some of which were believed to be hidden within the chapel. Sophia's attention was drawn to a particular diagram depicting a hidden chamber within the chapel's walls, marked with a symbol that resembled a key. Following the instructions in the scroll, Sophia began to search the chamber for the hidden chamber. She inspected the walls and floor, looking for any signs of concealed passages or secret compartments. After some careful investigation, she discovered a small, hidden latch embedded in the wall. With a gentle tug, the latch released, revealing a concealed door that swung open to reveal a narrow, dimly lit corridor. Sophia carefully entered the corridor, her steps echoing softly in the confined space. The corridor led to a small, hidden vault, its heavy door adorned with intricate carvings and a large, ornate lock. Sophia examined the vault door, noting the complex design of the lock. It seemed to require a specific sequence to open. Using the clues from the scrolls, she carefully manipulated the lock, aligning the symbols and pressing the correct sequence. With a satisfying click, the vault door swung open, revealing its contents. Inside, Sophia found a collection of ancient relics and artifacts, including a beautifully crafted chalice, a silver candlestick, and several ornate reliquaries. The relics were carefully arranged on velvet-lined shelves, their surfaces polished and gleaming despite their age. At the center of the vault was a small, intricately carved wooden box. Sophia carefully opened the box to reveal a delicate, jeweled cross, its surface encrusted with precious stones and intricate filigree. The cross seemed to radiate a faint, otherworldly light, adding to the sense of reverence and mystery surrounding the chamber. As Sophia examined the relics, she felt a deep sense of connection to the chapel's past. The hidden chamber and its contents revealed a part of the chapel's history that had been long forgotten, a testament to the devotion and faith of those who had once worshipped there. With a final glance at the relics and the hidden chamber, Sophia began her ascent back to the main chapel. The secrets of the forgotten sanctuary had been uncovered, but the sense of solemnity and reverence remained. As she emerged from the chapel and stepped back into the daylight, the world outside seemed brighter and more vibrant. The forgotten sanctuary had revealed a piece of its past, a reminder of the faith and devotion that had once filled its walls. The relics and the hidden chamber would remain a part of the chapel's history, a testament to its sacred past and the mysteries that lay within. Chapter 17. The Abandoned Amusement Park. The abandoned amusement park lay on the outskirts of the city, a forgotten relic of bygone days. Its rusted rides and weathered attractions stood in eerie silence, overgrown with weeds and creeping vines. The park's once bright colors had faded to dull, muted tones, and the air was filled with the faint scent of decay and neglect. Lena arrived at the park as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. She walked through a gap in the chain-link fence that had long since fallen into disrepair. The gate creaked ominously as she pushed it open, revealing the entrance to the park. The park's entrance was marked by a grand archway, its once vibrant paint now peeling and cracked. The name of the park, once emblazoned in bold letters, was now barely discernible. Lena stepped through the archway and into the main plaza, where the remains of carnival booths and game stalls stood empty and forlorn. The central plaza was dominated by a large, dilapidated carousel. The carousel's once colorful horses were now faded and chipped, their painted eyes staring vacantly into the void. The carousel's music box, long silent, had rusted into disrepair, and its ornate details were obscured by layers of grime. Lena approached the carousel, her footsteps crunching on the gravel beneath her. She traced her fingers along the carousel's railing, noting the intricate carvings and the once brilliant colors that had faded over time. The air was still, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. Adjacent to the carousel was a decrepit Ferris wheel, its towering frame silhouetted against the setting sun. The Ferris wheel's seats were empty and covered in rust, their once bright colors now dulled and peeling. The wheel itself was frozen in place, its motion stilled by years of neglect. Lena moved closer to the Ferris wheel, observing the broken and twisted gears that were visible through gaps in the structure. The Ferris wheel's base was overgrown with weeds and vines, and the once gleaming metal had become a patchwork of rust and corrosion. Beyond the Ferris wheel, Lena discovered a row of abandoned game booths. The booths were adorned with faded posters and tattered prizes, their bright colors long since washed out by the elements. The counters were cluttered with broken toys and old, dusty tickets. She noticed a particularly forlorn booth, its sign reading "Ring Toss" in faded letters. The rings were scattered on the floor, and the targets were broken and covered in cobwebs. Lena picked up one of the rings, noting its weight and the worn surface. The booth's once cheerful decorations were now grim and forlorn. Further into the park, Lena came upon a small, neglected zoo area. The enclosures were empty, their once pristine cages now rusted and overgrown with foliage. The signs that once identified the animals were now barely readable, their letters obscured by dirt and grime. The central feature of the zoo was a large, empty pond that had once housed a variety of waterfowl. The pond was now a stagnant, murky pool, its surface covered in a thick layer of algae. The surrounding area was overgrown with tall grass and reeds, and the occasional rustling of wildlife disturbed the silence. Lena made her way to the park's central pavilion, a once grand structure that had served as a gathering place for visitors. The pavilion's ornate roof had partially collapsed, and its walls were covered in graffiti and faded murals. The interior was filled with debris, including broken furniture and discarded remnants of past events. She noticed a small stage at the back of the pavilion, its platform covered in dust and cobwebs. The stage's backdrop was adorned with peeling paint and faded curtains, a reminder of the performances and events that had once taken place there. The stage was now silent and empty, its history lost to the ravages of time. As Lena explored the pavilion, she stumbled upon a hidden compartment beneath the stage. The compartment contained a collection of old photographs and memorabilia from the park's early days. The photographs showed scenes of joy and excitement, with smiling faces and lively attractions. Among the memorabilia were old tickets, brochures, and promotional materials, all bearing the park's name and logo. The materials were yellowed and worn, but they provided a glimpse into the park's vibrant past. Lena carefully examined the items, piecing together the story of the amusement park and the people who had once enjoyed its attractions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena took one last look around the park. The amusement park, though abandoned and forgotten, still held echoes of its former glory. The rusting rides, overgrown foliage, and abandoned attractions all told a story of joy and excitement that had once filled the space. With a final, wistful glance, Lena made her way back through the chain-link gate and out of the park. The amusement park's legacy, though hidden in the shadows of neglect, would continue to resonate through the memories of those who had once experienced its magic. Chapter 18. The Enigmatic Lighthouse. Perched on a rugged cliff overlooking the tempestuous sea, the lighthouse stood resolute against the battering winds and crashing waves. Its stark, white facade was weathered and scarred by the elements, but its commanding presence remained unwavering. The lighthouse had been long abandoned, its light extinguished and its purpose forgotten by all but the most curious of souls. Elena arrived at the base of the lighthouse as a storm rolled in, dark clouds swirling ominously above. The waves pounded against the rocks below, their roar echoing in the tumultuous atmosphere. Elena approached the lighthouse, the wind whipping her coat around her as she pushed open the heavy, rusted door. The interior of the lighthouse was dimly lit by the flickering light from a small, cracked window. Dust motes danced in the air as Elena stepped inside, her footsteps reverberating in the empty space. The walls of the lighthouse were lined with old nautical maps and faded photographs, remnants of a bygone era. She ascended the narrow, spiral staircase that wound its way up the lighthouse tower. Each step creaked under her weight, and the air grew colder and more damp as she climbed. The walls of the staircase were lined with old, weathered brass fittings and maritime tools, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust. At the top of the staircase, Elena emerged into the lantern room. The room was dominated by the large, intricate lens of the lighthouse's old beacon. The lens, once a marvel of engineering, was now covered in grime and cobwebs. The metal framework that housed the lens was rusted and corroded, but it still held a certain mechanical elegance. Elena moved closer to the lens, observing the delicate prisms and mirrors that had once refracted the light to guide sailors safely. The lens was surrounded by various brass mechanisms and gears, all of which had long since ceased to function. The room was filled with the scent of old oil and the faint tang of salt from the sea below. In the corner of the lantern room, Elena found a small, wooden desk covered in scattered papers and nautical instruments. The papers were yellowed and brittle, and they included detailed sketches of the lighthouse's original design, along with handwritten notes and calculations. The notes spoke of the lighthouse's construction and the engineering challenges faced by its builders. Among the papers was an old, leather-bound journal. Elena carefully opened the journal, revealing pages filled with meticulous handwriting and diagrams. The journal belonged to the lighthouse keeper, and it detailed his daily routines, observations, and personal reflections. The entries spoke of the harsh weather conditions, the loneliness of the lighthouse, and the small victories and challenges faced in maintaining the beacon. Elena continued to explore the lantern room, taking in the faded murals and inscriptions on the walls. The murals depicted scenes of maritime life and the lighthouse's role in guiding ships through treacherous waters. The inscriptions, though worn and partially obscured, conveyed messages of hope and safety to those who navigated the perilous seas. She discovered a hidden compartment within the wall, accessed by sliding aside a panel. Inside the compartment were several small, brass boxes and a collection of old maps and navigational charts. The maps were marked with various coordinates and routes, some of which indicated previously unknown maritime features and hazards. One of the brass boxes contained a series of small, intricately crafted models of ships and navigational instruments. The models were exquisitely detailed, each one a testament to the craftsmanship and dedication of the lighthouse keeper. Elena examined the models, noting their fine workmanship and the care taken in their creation. As the storm outside grew more intense, Elena could hear the wind howling and the rain beating against the lighthouse walls. The lantern room, though abandoned and silent, seemed to resonate with the history and significance of its past. The lighthouse had once served as a beacon of hope and safety for countless sailors, its light cutting through the darkness and guiding them to safety. With a final look around the lantern room and a deep sense of appreciation for the lighthouse's history, Elena began her descent back to the base. The storm raged outside, but the lighthouse stood firm, its legacy etched into its very structure. As she left the lighthouse and stepped back into the stormy night, Elena felt a profound connection to the lighthouse and its keeper. The lighthouse, though silent and forgotten, continued to stand as a testament to the dedication and resilience of those who had once maintained it. Its enigmatic presence would remain a symbol of guidance and hope, even as the storm raged around it. Chapter 19. The Deserted Hospital. The deserted hospital stood at the edge of town, its imposing structure a relic of a bygone era. The once grand building, now cloaked in decay and neglect, loomed against the overcast sky. Its windows were shattered, and the exterior was marred by peeling paint and creeping vines. The hospital had been abandoned for years, its corridors and rooms left to gather dust and silence. David arrived at the hospital's entrance, where the heavy wooden doors hung ajar, their hinges rusted and creaking in the wind. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside, the musty air hitting him like a wall. The lobby was vast and echoing, with faded linoleum floors and cracked, yellowed walls. The reception desk was cluttered with old, forgotten paperwork and abandoned medical equipment. A once bustling area, now silent and still, it bore witness to the passage of time. Dust-covered filing cabinets stood in disarray, their contents spilling out and mingling with the detritus on the floor. David moved past the reception area and ventured into the main hallway. The hallway was lined with closed doors, each one marked with a faded plaque indicating its purpose: offices, exam rooms, patient wards. The walls were adorned with peeling paint and the occasional, tattered sign. He approached one of the doors labeled Emergency Room, pushing it open to reveal a large, empty space. The emergency room was filled with rusting gurneys and outdated medical apparatus. The once sterile environment was now coated in a layer of grime, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. The heart monitor, long since disconnected, sat abandoned on a counter, its display dark and lifeless. The sinks and counters were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the room was filled with the scent of old antiseptic mixed with mildew. David continued his exploration, moving through the corridors and into the patient wards. The wards were filled with old beds, their metal frames rusted and their mattresses stained and worn. The curtains that once provided privacy were now shredded and hanging limply. In one of the wards, David discovered a series of old medical charts pinned to a bulletin board. The charts were yellowed with age and contained handwritten notes about various patients, their ailments, and treatments. The notes were faded and partially illegible, but they provided a glimpse into the hospital's past. He proceeded to the hospital's basement, where the utility rooms and storage areas were located. The basement was dimly lit and filled with old, forgotten supplies. Shelves were lined with expired medications and dusty medical instruments. A large, rusting boiler stood in one corner, its purpose long forgotten. In a small, locked room within the basement, David found a collection of old patient files and medical records. The files were meticulously organized but were now covered in a thick layer of dust. The records included detailed notes on treatments and procedures, as well as personal information about the patients. Among the files, David discovered a large, ornate chest. He carefully opened the chest to find a collection of old, medical relics, antique syringes, glass bottles of medicine, and vintage surgical instruments. The items were beautifully crafted, but their once pristine surfaces were now tarnished and worn. He also found a small, old medical journal bound in leather. The journal contained handwritten entries about the hospital's history, including accounts of significant events and changes over the years. The entries were detailed and descriptive, offering a glimpse into the daily life of the hospital and its staff. As David explored the basement, he came across a large, old generator that had long since ceased to function. The generator was covered in a thick layer of dust, and its control panel was filled with cobwebs. It was a reminder of the hospital's once bustling energy and the life that had been sustained within its walls. Returning to the main floors, David wandered through the hallways and patient rooms once more, taking in the eerie silence and desolation. The hospital, though abandoned and forgotten, still held the echoes of its past, a place where lives had been saved and stories had unfolded. As he left the hospital and stepped back into the overcast day, David felt a deep sense of reflection. The hospital, with its faded memories and abandoned spaces, stood as a testament to the passage of time and the inevitable decay of all things. Its once vital purpose had been lost to history, but the remnants of its past remained, a silent witness to the lives it had touched and the history it had witnessed. Chapter 20. The Forgotten Cemetery. The forgotten cemetery lay hidden in the midst of an overgrown forest, its ancient gravestones and mausoleums obscured by a tangle of vines and foliage. The cemetery had long been abandoned, its once pristine grounds now swallowed by nature's relentless encroachment. The gravestones, weathered and worn, stood as silent sentinels amidst the wild growth. Anna arrived at the cemetery as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the scene. The cemetery's entrance was marked by a rusted iron gate, its intricate design barely visible through the thick layer of rust. The gate creaked as Anna pushed it open, revealing the overgrown path leading into the heart of the cemetery. The path was flanked by rows of crumbling gravestones, their inscriptions nearly illegible from years of exposure to the elements. Many of the stones were toppled or broken, their fragments scattered among the wild undergrowth. The cemetery was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Anna made her way deeper into the cemetery, passing by ancient mausoleums and family tombs. The mausoleums were grand structures, now marred by time and neglect. Their marble facades were cracked and covered in moss, and their once imposing doors were ajar or missing entirely. Inside one of the mausoleums, Anna found a series of crypts and sarcophagi. The crypts were lined with faded inscriptions and ornate carvings, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The sarcophagi were partially open, their interiors shrouded in darkness. The mausoleum was filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying stone, and the air was cool and still. Anna noticed that some of the crypts contained remnants of old funeral decorations, wilted flowers, faded wreaths, and tattered ribbons. These remnants told stories of long-forgotten funerals and the lives once remembered within these walls. As Anna continued her exploration, she discovered a small, secluded corner of the cemetery where several ancient oak trees grew. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Beneath the trees, the ground was littered with fallen leaves and broken branches. In this corner, Anna found a cluster of small, unmarked graves. The graves were simple and unadorned, with only crude wooden markers to indicate their presence. The markers were weathered and nearly illegible, but they hinted at the presence of forgotten souls whose final resting place had been left unceremoniously. Anna carefully examined one of the markers, noting the simple inscription carved into the wood. The inscription was barely readable, but it spoke of a person who had once lived and died many years ago. The marker was surrounded by a small collection of tokens, wilted flowers, small stones, and rusted trinkets left by mourners long since departed. Moving away from the small graves, Anna stumbled upon an old caretaker's cottage situated at the edge of the cemetery. The cottage was a small, weather-beaten structure, its windows broken and its roof partially collapsed. The garden around the cottage was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, and the once pristine pathways were now obscured by nature. Inside the cottage, Anna found a collection of old gardening tools and supplies. The tools were rusty and covered in a thick layer of dust, a testament to years of abandonment. The shelves were filled with empty jars and faded labels, remnants of a time when the cottage had been maintained and cared for. In one corner of the cottage, Anna discovered a small, old ledger. The ledger contained handwritten notes and records related to the cemetery's upkeep. The notes detailed the maintenance schedules, burial records, and other aspects of the cemetery's management. The ledger was yellowed with age and the ink had faded, but it provided a glimpse into the care that had once been given to the cemetery. Anna's exploration of the cemetery led her to a large, central monument. The monument was an elaborate obelisk, its surface adorned with intricate carvings and inscriptions. The monument was dedicated to a prominent figure or family, but the inscriptions were worn and difficult to read. The monument stood as a solemn reminder of the cemetery's past significance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Anna took a final look around. The forgotten cemetery, though overgrown and neglected, held a profound sense of history and reverence. Its weathered gravestones and abandoned mausoleums stood as silent witnesses to the lives once lived and the memories now lost to time. With a sense of reflection and respect, Anna made her way back to the cemetery's entrance. The overgrown path led her out of the cemetery and into the encroaching twilight. The forgotten cemetery remained a silent, enduring testament to the passage of time and the lives that had once found their final resting place within its bounds. Chapter 21. The Abyss. The abandoned amusement park sprawled out across a vast, overgrown area on the outskirts of town. Once a vibrant hub of joy and excitement, it was now a place of eerie desolation and decay. The rusting rides and dilapidated attractions stood as ghostly remnants of their former glory, shrouded in an air of melancholy. Olivia arrived at the entrance of the park, where the ticket booths and turnstiles were coated in layers of grime and cobwebs. The once colorful paint on the booths had faded to dull, peeling hues, and the turnstiles groaned as they shifted under her touch. The gates, once adorned with cheerful banners, were now rusted and partially ajar. She stepped into the park, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The central plaza was dominated by a large, decrepit carousel, its once vibrant horses and chariots now faded and covered in a thick layer of dust. The carousel's music box, long silent, was a tangle of broken gears and frayed wires. Nearby, the Ferris wheel loomed large, its once bright colors now dulled by years of neglect. The wheel had stopped in place, its cabin swaying slightly in the wind. The surrounding area was strewn with rusting support beams and scattered debris, remnants of the wheel's former operation. Olivia wandered through the park, passing by the various attractions. The roller coaster tracks lay twisted and overgrown with weeds, and the once thrilling ride was now a skeleton of rusted metal. The coaster cars, once vibrant and exciting, were now corroded and abandoned, their seats overrun with grime. She continued to the funhouse, a large, sprawling structure with a whimsical facade now marred by peeling paint and broken windows. Inside, the funhouse was a labyrinth of dark, twisting corridors and warped mirrors. The mirrors, once designed to amuse, were now cracked and distorted, reflecting a twisted and unsettling version of reality. In the center of the funhouse, Olivia discovered a small, run-down stage. The stage, once the site of lively performances and entertainment, was now empty and covered in dust. The curtain, once bright and colorful, was tattered and hanging limply. Next, Olivia found her way to the park's old water attraction. The once bustling log flume ride was now dry and filled with stagnant water. The boats, once sleek and inviting, were now weathered and partially submerged. The surrounding pool was overrun with algae and debris, and the ride splash zone was silent and still. She explored the park's food stands and game booths, each one a relic of the past. The food stands were filled with faded signage and broken equipment, and the game booths were empty, their prizes long since removed. The once lively scent of popcorn and cotton candy was replaced by the musty odor of decay. Olivia made her way to the park's central fountain, a grand structure that had once been the focal point of the park. The fountain was now dry and cracked, its basin filled with leaves and debris. The sculptures that adorned the fountain were weathered and worn, their once detailed features now eroded by time. In a secluded corner of the park, Olivia found a small, overgrown garden. The garden was filled with wilting flowers and overgrown weeds, and a broken statue stood at its center. The statue, though damaged, was still recognizable as a symbol of the park's former charm and elegance. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Olivia took a final look around. The abandoned amusement park, though overgrown and forgotten, held a haunting beauty. Its rusting rides and empty attractions stood as silent witnesses to the joy and excitement that once filled its grounds. With a sense of nostalgia and reflection, Olivia made her way back to the park's entrance. The path was lined with weeds and fallen leaves, and the park's once vibrant colors were now muted by the encroaching twilight. The abandoned amusement park remained a poignant reminder of the passage of time and the fleeting nature of happiness. Chapter 22. The Hidden Laboratory. The hidden laboratory lay concealed beneath a seemingly ordinary warehouse on the outskirts of town. Its entrance, disguised as a maintenance door, was partially obscured by overgrown weeds and rusting equipment. The door creaked open with a low groan, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness below. Emma carefully made her way down the stairs, the air growing cooler and mustier with each step. The dim light of her flashlight flickered against the walls, revealing old pipes and cobwebs that adorned the narrow passage. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, dimly lit anteroom. The anteroom was sparsely furnished with a few old chairs and a rickety table. On the table lay a stack of faded blueprints and yellow documents. The documents were scattered and partially illegible, but they hinted at the complex nature of the laboratory's work. A single, flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. Emma moved past the anteroom and into the main laboratory. The laboratory was a vast, open space filled with an array of outdated scientific equipment and clutter. Old workbenches lined the walls, each covered in rusting instruments, glassware, and partially dismantled devices. The once sterile environment was now coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. In one corner of the laboratory, Emma discovered a large, old centrifuge. The centrifuge was covered in a thick layer of dust, and its controls were rusted and unresponsive. Nearby, a set of old glass containers were lined up on a shelf, their contents long since evaporated or degraded. Emma's attention was drawn to a series of metal cabinets against the far wall. The cabinets were locked and their surfaces were tarnished. She managed to pry open one of the cabinets to find a collection of old chemical bottles and vials. The labels on the bottles were faded and difficult to read, but they hinted at the types of experiments that had been conducted here. Adjacent to the cabinets was a large, complex apparatus, a combination of tubes, gauges, and dials. The apparatus was partially dismantled, and its purpose was unclear. A tangle of wires and cables extended from the apparatus, some of which were frayed and exposed. The device stood as a testament to the laboratory's once advanced technology. Emma continued her exploration and came across a small, cluttered office within the laboratory. The office was filled with old filing cabinets, each crammed with yellowed papers and reports. The papers detailed various experiments, research findings, and notes on the laboratory's work. The reports were filled with complex diagrams and calculations, hinting at the depth of the research conducted in this hidden space. On a desk in the office, Emma found a collection of old photographs and personal items. The photographs depicted scientists and researchers, their faces obscured by shadows or turned away from the camera. The personal items included faded notes, a worn-out calendar, and a broken clock, all remnants of a bygone era. As Emma explored further, she found a series of old, metal storage containers stacked against a wall. The containers were sealed tightly, their surfaces covered in rust and grime. She managed to open one of the containers to reveal a collection of old lab equipment, including beakers, test tubes, and pipettes. The equipment was coated in a thick layer of dust, but it was clear that it had once been meticulously organized. In the center of the laboratory, Emma discovered a large, old microscope mounted on a heavy metal stand. The microscope was covered in dust, and its lenses were fogged and obscured. Nearby, a collection of glass slides and sample jars were lined up on a shelf. The slides were stained and partially covered with dust, and the samples had long since deteriorated. As the light in the laboratory dimmed, Emma took a final look around. The hidden laboratory, though abandoned and neglected, held a sense of mystery and intrigue. Its outdated equipment and scattered documents told a story of scientific discovery and experimentation, now lost to time. With a final glance at the forgotten space, Emma made her way back to the staircase. The narrow passage led her back to the warehouse above, and the hidden laboratory remained a silent testament to the pursuit of knowledge and the passage of time. The laboratory's secrets were preserved in the layers of dust and the remnants of its once vibrant research, waiting to be uncovered and remembered. Chapter 23: The Remote Lighthouse. The remote lighthouse stood isolated on a craggy cliff overlooking the stormy sea. Its imposing structure, weathered by years of salt and wind, was a solitary beacon against the turbulent backdrop of waves crashing against the jagged rocks below. The lighthouse, a towering column of aged stone, was encircled by a barren landscape of scrub and seaweed. Sophia approached the lighthouse as the storm clouds gathered overhead, casting a foreboding shadow across the scene. The lighthouse's exterior was encrusted with salt and grime, its once pristine white paint now a peeling and discolored layer. The metal door at the base of the lighthouse was rusted and creaked ominously as Sophia pushed it open. Inside the lighthouse, the air was cool and musty, carrying the scent of damp stone and sea spray. The entrance led to a small, dimly lit foyer with walls lined in faded nautical maps and old, frayed ropes. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, disturbed only by Sophia's footsteps. She ascended the spiral staircase that wound its way up the lighthouse's interior. The staircase was narrow and steep, and the stone steps were worn smooth from years of use. The walls of the staircase were lined with old lanterns and rusted iron fixtures, casting fleeting shadows in the dim light. At the top of the staircase, Sophia emerged into the lantern room. The lantern room was an open space with large glass windows offering a panoramic view of the stormy sea. The glass was grimy and streaked with salt, but the view was nonetheless breathtaking. The storm was in full force, with lightning flashing and waves crashing violently against the rocks below. The central feature of the lantern room was the massive glass beacon, a complex array of lenses and mirrors designed to project a powerful light across the sea. The beacon was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the glass was fogged and scratched. The mechanism that powered the beacon was silent and still, its gears and cogs covered in rust and cobwebs. Adjacent to the beacon was an old control panel, its levers and dials frozen in place. The panel was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the dials were rusted and unresponsive. Beside the panel was a set of old, yellowed logbooks and maintenance records. The logbooks were filled with handwritten notes detailing the lighthouse's operation, its maintenance schedule, and various weather observations. The pages were yellowed and brittle, hinting at the passage of many years. Sophia moved to the side of the lantern room where a small, rickety desk was set against the wall. On the desk lay an assortment of old navigational tools, including a sextant, compasses, and charts. The tools were dusty and tarnished, but they once played a crucial role in guiding ships safely through treacherous waters. In one corner of the lantern room was a narrow door leading to a small, cluttered storeroom. The storeroom was filled with old supplies and equipment, including spare light bulbs, coils of wire, and cans of oil. The supplies were coated in dust, and many of the cans were rusted and leaking. Sophia carefully examined a shelf of old logbooks and personal journals, their covers worn and pages yellowed. The journals contained detailed accounts of the lighthouse keeper's daily life, weather conditions, and occasional personal reflections. The entries were written in a meticulous hand, reflecting the dedication and solitude of life in the lighthouse. As Sophia explored the lighthouse, she noticed the occasional draft blowing through the structure. The drafts came from gaps in the stone walls and the aging windows, adding to the eerie, forlorn atmosphere of the lighthouse. The storm outside continued to rage, its fury amplified by the high vantage point of the lantern room. Sophia took one last look around the lighthouse before making her way back down the spiral staircase. The lighthouse, though abandoned and battered by the elements, remained a solemn guardian of the sea. Its weathered exterior and dust-covered interior told the story of its long history and the solitary life of those who once manned its beacon. With a final glance at the stormy sea and the craggy cliff below, Sophia left the lighthouse and made her way back to the safety of the land. The remote lighthouse stood resolute against the storm, a silent sentinel preserving its history and purpose amidst the relentless forces of nature. Chapter 24: The Deserted Asylum. The deserted asylum lay in a remote part of the countryside, its imposing structure emerging from the mist like a ghostly apparition. The asylum, with its grim, Gothic architecture, stood surrounded by overgrown fields and a wrought iron fence that was falling into disrepair. The once grand entrance, flanked by crumbling stone pillars, was partially obscured by a tangle of vines and weeds. Jessica approached the main building, her steps echoing through the empty grounds. The entrance doors were large and heavy, their wood rotting and splintered. They creaked as she pushed them open, revealing a dimly lit foyer. The foyer was vast, with high ceilings and ornate details now tarnished by age and neglect. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. The walls of the foyer were lined with faded portraits of stern-faced figures, their eyes seeming to follow Jessica as she moved. The ornate chandeliers hanging from the ceiling were covered in cobwebs, their crystals dust-covered and dull. The large reception desk at the center of the foyer was empty, save for a few scattered, yellowed papers. Jessica made her way through the asylum's corridors, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The corridors were long and winding, lined with heavy wooden doors that were either ajar or hanging off their hinges. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and faded paint, and the floor was littered with broken tiles and debris. In one of the corridors, Jessica found a series of patient rooms. The rooms were small and sparse, each furnished with a narrow bed, a metal bed frame, and a solitary chair. The bed sheets were tattered and stained, and the chairs were covered in dust. The walls of the rooms were adorned with old, tattered artwork and faded motivational posters. Jessica entered a large, open common area that had once been a place for socialization and activities. The area was now filled with overturned furniture and broken tables. The once bright murals on the walls were peeling and faded, and the large windows were covered in grime, allowing only a dim light to filter through. She moved on to the treatment rooms and medical offices. The treatment rooms were equipped with rusting medical instruments and old, cracked examination tables. The medical offices contained shelves filled with dusty bottles of medications, abandoned file cabinets with disorganized records, and a worn desk with an old typewriter. In one of the offices, Jessica discovered a room dedicated to electroshock therapy. The room contained a large, outdated machine covered in dust, its wires and electrodes hanging loosely. The machine stood as a chilling reminder of the asylum's past practices. Further into the asylum, Jessica came across the kitchen and dining area. The kitchen was filled with rusted appliances, empty cans, and broken dishes. The dining area had long tables covered in dust and a few overturned chairs. The remnants of a once bustling dining space were now silent and forlorn. Jessica made her way to the asylum's library, a large room filled with rows of wooden shelves lined with old books. The books were covered in dust and cobwebs, and many had fallen from their shelves. The library's once comfortable reading chairs were now tattered and worn. In the asylum's basement, Jessica found the storage area, filled with old, broken furniture and discarded items. The basement was dimly lit and musty, with a low ceiling and exposed pipes. The storage area was cluttered with remnants of the asylum's past, including old uniforms, medical supplies, and various personal effects. As the daylight waned, Jessica took one final look around the asylum. The deserted asylum, though abandoned and decayed, held a somber and eerie beauty. Its once pristine rooms and bustling spaces were now silent and forlorn, bearing witness to the passage of time and the haunting history of its past inhabitants. With a heavy heart and a sense of melancholy, Jessica left the asylum, closing the creaking doors behind her. The deserted asylum remained a poignant reminder of its once vibrant life, now preserved in its state of abandonment and decay. The asylum's secrets and memories lingered in the shadows, waiting to be remembered and respected. Chapter 25. The Forgotten Carnival. The forgotten carnival lay in the heart of an overgrown field, its once colorful tints now faded and tattered. The remnants of joyous laughter and vibrant music had long since faded into silence, replaced by an eerie stillness. The carnival's entrance, marked by a grand archway adorned with peeling paint and rusting lights, was partially obscured by tall, wild grass. Mia entered the carnival grounds through the sagging archway, the rustling of the tall grass the only sound breaking the silence. The once vibrant banners and streamers that had adorned the entrance were now shredded and tangled in the wind. The carnival's pathways were overgrown and cracked, with weeds pushing through the broken pavement. The first stop was the main area where the large, decaying tent stood. The tent's fabric was torn and stained, sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The once colorful stripes were now faded and bleached by the sun. Inside, the ground was littered with broken carnival game booths, their vibrant paint chipped and peeling. A rusting Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its seats empty and its structure covered in a layer of grime. Mia walked over to the Ferris wheel, its towering presence casting long shadows across the carnival grounds. The Ferris wheel's mechanical arms were encrusted with rust, and the wheel itself was partially obscured by overgrown vines. The seats, once brightly painted, were now faded and covered in a thick layer of dust. The once fun ride now stood silent and motionless, a ghost of its former self. Nearby, Mia discovered the old carousel. The carousel's ornate horses, once meticulously crafted and painted, were now chipped and broken. The carousel's central column was rusty, and the mirrors that had once sparkled with reflected light were now cracked and dulled. The music mechanism, if it had ever existed, was long since silent, leaving only the creaking of the carousel's structure in the wind. In a section of the carnival dedicated to games and attractions, Mia found a row of old booths and stalls. The booths were filled with faded prizes and dusty trinkets. The game counters were cracked and splintered, with remnants of old signage barely visible beneath layers of grime. The shooting gallery and ring toss booth were in disarray, their once bright colors now muted and grimy. Mia moved on to the concession stand area. The stands, once bustling with activity, were now empty and abandoned. The counters were covered in a layer of dust and grime, and the old popcorn machines and cotton candy makers were rusting and inoperable. The smell of stale popcorn and sugary sweets had long since vanished, replaced by the scent of decay. Further into the carnival grounds, Mia found the funhouse. The funhouse's facade was warped and distorted, with peeling paint and broken mirrors. The entrance was partially blocked by debris, and the interior was dark and cluttered with old carnival props and broken animatronics. The funhouse's labyrinth of mirrors and twisted pathways was now a maze of shadows and dust. In the far corner of the carnival, Mia discovered a small, dilapidated ticket booth. The booth was covered in rust and decay, with old, faded ticket stubs scattered on the ground. The ticket booth's window was cracked, and the ticket machine inside was broken and covered in grime. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the carnival grounds, Mia took a final look around. The forgotten carnival, once a place of joy and excitement, now stood as a solemn reminder of the passage of time and the inevitable decay of all things. Its faded colors, broken attractions, and empty grounds told a story of the past, now silent and abandoned. With a heavy heart and a sense of melancholy, Mia left the carnival grounds, the memory of its past splendor lingering in the shadows. The forgotten carnival remained a poignant symbol of nostalgia and loss, a place where the echoes of laughter and music had long since faded into the silence of abandonment.